I am Zuri, and for 25 years I believed my only purpose was to serve. While my brother was raised as a prince, I was simply handed a mop. I spent my entire life cleaning up his messes and staying invisible. But on the night of his lavish rehearsal dinner, an intentional glass of spilled wine and a stinging slap across my face set off a chain of events no one saw coming. The father of the bride happened to look closely at my collarbone and made a single phone call that unraveled 2 decades of lies. Before I continue with this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly endure disrespect while plotting your ultimate exit. The massive crystal chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Hotel cast a golden glow over the rehearsal dinner, reflecting the immense wealth my family desperately wanted to project. My brother Malik stood at the center of the ballroom, wearing a tailored tuxedo, laughing loudly with a glass of champagne. He was the absolute golden child, the undeniable pride of our community, the brilliant young entrepreneur about to marry into high society. I was on my hands and knees in the far corner wearing a drab gray uniform, scrubbing a scuff mark off the polished marble floor. Pastor Calvin and Vivian. The cruel people I called mother and father made sure I knew my place. They ran a prominent congregation in Atlanta, preaching grace on Sundays while treating me like an unpaid servant the rest of the week. Tonight was Malik's grand entrance into the elite circles of his fiancée, Chloe Kensington. Chloe glided effortlessly across the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. I kept my head down, focusing on the floor, hoping to remain invisible. But visibility is a funny thing when someone wants to make a point. Chloe finally stopped right beside me. I could see the sharp-pointed toe of her shoe mere inches from my hand. Without any warning, a cold splash of dark red wine hit my shoulder, soaking through my uniform and pooling on the floor I had just cleaned. I looked up. Chloe was holding an empty wine glass, her lips curled into a painted sneer. She did not even try to pretend it was an accident. She just sighed, dramatically complaining to the guests that the help was always in the way. Within seconds, Pastor Calvin and Vivian materialized beside us, their faces transformed into masks of concern for Chloe and concealed rage for me. Vivian did not even bother to ask what had happened. She did not look at my soaked uniform or the wine dripping down my arm. She looked at Chloe's shoes, which had a single drop of wine near the sole. "Get up right now," Vivian hissed at me. Before I could even push myself off the cold floor, her hand swung down. The slap echoed over the jazz music playing in the background. It was a hard strike that snapped my head to the side and left a burning imprint across my cheek. "Look what you just did to her beautiful shoes," Vivian whispered viciously, grabbing my arm and digging her manicured nails deep into my skin. "I should have left you at that wretched orphanage when you were a baby. You were born to serve Malik, to make his life easier. Clean this mess up right now and get out of my sight. You are an embarrassment to this family." I did not cry. Years of being locked in the parsonage basement, while Malik received private tutors and brand new cars, had burned the tears out of me long ago. I simply lowered my head back to the hard floor and grabbed my cleaning cloth. As I slowly wiped the red wine near Chloe's foot, my eyes locked onto the serial number stamped on the inside arch of her expensive designer shoe. I memorized the numbers instantly. A calculating calm settled over me. They thought I was just a lowly maid with a rag. They had no idea my mind was a steel trap, processing data, cataloging every detail, and preparing for the day I would tear their fraudulent lives apart, piece by piece. While I scrubbed the marble, I felt a very heavy gaze fixed intently on me. I glanced up through my eyelashes and saw Richard Kensington, Chloe's billionaire father, standing near the edge of the ballroom. He was not looking at the spilled wine. He was staring directly at the side of my neck. When Vivian had viciously slapped me, the collar of my cheap uniform slipped sideways, exposing my bare skin. Right below my collarbone sat a distinct birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon. Richard's face drained of color. He stood paralyzed, his champagne glass forgotten. I watched as he discreetly pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket, his hands trembling slightly. He raised it and snapped a quick photo of me while pretending to check a text message. He immediately turned his back to the noisy, crowded room and walked briskly toward the secluded terrace doors. I kept scrubbing the floor, but my focus followed him closely. Through the glass doors, I saw him press the phone to his ear, pacing frantically in the cool night air. He was speaking to Isaiah Montgomery, the legendary real estate mogul, whose name commanded immense respect across the country. Richard's voice was low, trembling, with a sudden urgency that cut through the darkness. "Isaiah," he said softly, his breath hitching audibly. "I know we have not spoken about this in years, but you need to listen to me right now. The beautiful daughter you lost 25 years ago. The one everyone said was gone forever. I am looking right at her. She has the exact crescent mark. Isaiah, she is right here scrubbing my daughter's shoes." Sizzling butter and pepper filled the cramped kitchen of the parsonage. I stood at the stove, calmly flipping an egg in the cast-iron skillet, acting as if the stinging red mark across my cheek from the night before was nothing but a shadow. The front door slammed with a violent thud, and heavy footsteps stomped down the hallway. Vivian marched into the kitchen wearing her Sunday finest on a Tuesday morning, clutching thick travel brochures. Calvin followed behind her, adjusting his pristine white clergy collar. They moved with calculated aggression, boxing me into the narrow space between the hot stove and the kitchen sink. "Turn that burner off and listen to us," Vivian snapped, slapping the brochures on the counter. The pages fanned out, displaying turquoise water and luxurious overwater bungalows. "Chloe wants Bora Bora for the honeymoon. It is $50,000 and her father refuses to pay for it. He says the groom's family handles honeymoon expenses. We cannot have the Kensington family thinking we are broke, Zuri. We have a reputation in this community to uphold, and you are going to help us protect it." I slid the egg onto my ceramic plate, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "That sounds like a Malik problem," I said quietly, refusing to look at her. "Not a Zuri problem." Calvin slammed his fist against the refrigerator door, rattling the magnets. "Do not use that disrespectful tone in my house. You have been hoarding cash from that little commercial cleaning job of yours for 5 years. We know you have money stashed away. It is time for you to pay us back for putting a roof over your head and food in your mouth. You owe this family everything." Before I could even point out that I had earned my keep by scrubbing the church pews, washing their dirty laundry, and cooking their meals, since I was tall enough to reach the kitchen sink, Malik strolled into the room. He wore a designer silk robe that probably cost a month of my supposed cleaning salary. He poured himself a cup of coffee, looking at me with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Just give them the money," Zuri, Malik scoffed, taking a slow, arrogant sip from his mug. "It is the least you can do. You live here rent-free. You contribute absolutely nothing to the legacy of this family. I am out here building an empire, rubbing shoulders with Silicon Valley investors, and expanding a tech startup that is going to change the world. You carry a mop bucket for a living. Just hand over your little savings book and maybe Chloe will let you clean our new house once we get back from the islands." I picked up my silver fork and cut perfectly into the center of my egg. "Building an empire." I repeated, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "That is a fascinating way to describe a company that burned through $200,000 of angel investment in 6 months without launching a single working prototype." Malik froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Vivian and Calvin exchanged a confused, panicked look. "What are you talking about?" Calvin demanded, stepping closer. "Malik's company is thriving. He is meeting with Vanguard today for a $5 million expansion loan." I leaned back against the counter, crossing my ankles. "I am talking about the fact that his customer acquisition cost is currently sitting at $400 per user, while the lifetime value of his product is exactly 0. I am talking about a profit margin that has been in the red since day one, massive overhead expenses from renting a luxury office, and a churn rate of 98%. Malik's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by the panicked realization that the girl who scrubbed his floors somehow knew the exact humiliating details of his failing business. "You are crazy," Malik stammered, stepping toward me, his voice pitching higher in defense. "You do not know what those words even mean. You probably heard me talking on the phone and memorized some big words to sound smart." You are just a jealous, bitter maid. He lunged forward, ignoring the hot stove, and snatched my worn purse right off the counter. He violently dumped the contents onto the floor. A small blue savings passbook clattered against the linoleum. Vivian quickly snatched the passbook up from the floor, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Let us see how much this ungrateful girl has been hiding from the people who saved her life. Vivian sneered, flipping the little blue book open. Her triumphant smile instantly dissolved. She blinked, pulling the book closer to her face as if her eyes were deceiving her. She flipped the page, then flipped it back, her jaw dropping open. $200, Vivian shrieked, shoving the book into Calvin's chest. She only has $200 to her name. Where's the rest of it? Where have you been hiding your paychecks? I looked at their furious, twisted faces and allowed a slow, cold smile to touch my lips. They were hyperventilating over $200, completely unaware that my actual net worth accumulated through years of aggressive corporate auditing, offshore investments, and massive corporate bonuses was sitting safely in a private account they could never touch. They thought they had trapped a mouse, but they had actually cornered a predator. I spent it all on cleaning supplies. I lied smoothly. Malik raised his hand, ready to strike me, just like his mother had done the night before. I stared right through him. But before his hand could swing down, a commanding knock echoed from the front door. The three of them froze. Vivian hurried to the window, peeking through the blinds. She gasped. "Calvin," she whispered. A black Maybach parked outside. The game had officially begun, and I was holding everything. Vivian did not care about the luxury car parked outside our crumbling sidewalk. The sight of that $200 balance had completely shattered her carefully manicured composure. She grabbed me by the collar of my cheap cotton shirt and dragged me toward the front door. Her grip was tight, her nails digging into my skin, just like they had the night before. Calvin and Malik followed close behind, yelling that I was an ungrateful parasite who had finally worn out my welcome. Vivian threw the front door open and shoved me onto the porch. I stumbled but caught my balance, refusing to fall for their entertainment. She turned back inside and emerged seconds later with my single battered duffel bag. She unzipped it and violently hurled my meager belongings across the patchy front lawn. My faded jeans, my few plain shirts, and my worn-out sneakers scattered across the damp grass. Members of the congregation were already arriving for the morning committee meetings, parking their modest sedans along the street. They stopped and stared their eyes wide as they watched their beloved pastor's wife completely lose her mind. Vivian noticed the audience and immediately shifted into her theatrical religious performance. She raised her hands toward the sky, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "Look at this demon we brought into our holy home," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "We tried to save her. We fed her. We clothed her. We treated her like our own flesh and blood. And how does she repay our Christian charity? By hiding money from us. By disrespecting my son. She is a test sent by the devil to ruin this family." Calvin stepped onto the porch, placing a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder, playing the part of the weary noble shepherd. He looked at the gathered church members with a sorrowful expression. "We have to cast out the wickedness from our sanctuary," he announced loudly. "We cannot harbor a liar and a thief." Malik stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his expensive silk robe, smirking down at me. "You heard them," he sneered. "Pick up your trash and get off our property. Let us see how long your smart mouth lasts on the streets." I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not fall to my knees and beg for their mercy, which I knew was exactly what they wanted to see. I calmly walked down the porch steps and began picking up my clothes. I folded each faded shirt with precision, placing them neatly back into the duffel bag. The congregation members murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in pity, others looking at me with the same disgust my adoptive parents had trained them to feel. Let them talk. I knew my offshore accounts held more money than this entire neighborhood combined. I just needed to walk away and activate my exit strategy. But the script was about to flip earlier than I planned. The heavy door of the black Maybach finally swung open. The murmurs of the congregation died instantly as Richard Kensington stepped onto the pavement. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, radiating an aura of absolute power and wealth that made Calvin's cheap pastoral authority look like a bad joke. He completely ignored the scattered clothes on the lawn. He ignored the whispering church members. He walked straight toward me, his expensive leather shoes stepping smoothly over the damp grass. Calvin's entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The righteous anger melted away, replaced by a desperate fawning panic. "Mr. Kensington!" Calvin stammered, rushing down the porch steps with his hand outstretched. "What a surprise! We were not expecting you. Please ignore this unfortunate family matter. We are just dealing with a troubled young woman who refuses to appreciate her blessings." Richard did not even look at Calvin. He bypassed the outstretched hand as if it did not exist, stopping right in front of me. He looked down at my cheap clothes, the red mark still visible on my cheek from Vivian's slap, and the half-packed duffel bag at my feet. The billionaire's jaw clenched. "You treat her like a stray dog?" Richard said, his voice dangerously low, but carrying enough weight to silence the entire street. Vivian scurried down the steps, forcing a tight, nervous smile. "Mr. Kensington, you do not understand. Zuri has severe behavioral issues. We have done everything we can, but she is a deeply ungrateful girl. We are just giving her some tough love." Richard finally turned his gaze to Vivian, and the sheer contempt in his eyes made her physically step back. "I understand perfectly," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I watched you strike her last night. I watched you treat her like a slave while you paraded your mediocre, bankrupt son around my country club. You preach about grace, yet you run a household built on cruelty and exploitation." Calvin sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of red as the congregation watched their spiritual leader get publicly dismantled. "Sir, I demand you show some respect. This is my property and she is my daughter." "She is absolutely nothing to you," Richard fired back, his voice slicing through the morning air like a blade. "You did not raise a daughter. You imprisoned an heiress to fund your pathetic lives." The entire lawn fell dead silent. Malik's smirk vanished completely. Vivian's mouth dropped open. Even I froze, the folded shirt slipping from my fingers. Richard turned his back on my abusers and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick, sealed envelope made of heavy ivory paper. He held it out to me. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were filled with a strange, fierce, protective light. "You do not belong on this lawn, Zuri," he said softly. "And you certainly do not belong to them. My car is waiting. It is time for you to go home." I looked from the envelope to Richard, then back at the bewildered, terrified faces of the family who had tortured me for 25 years. I did not ask questions. I grabbed my duffel bag, took the envelope from Richard's hand, and walked straight toward the Maybach. "Zuri, get back here right now," Calvin yelled, his voice cracking with panic as his control slipped away. "You cannot just leave. We are your family." I paused at the car door and looked back at him. My voice was perfectly steady. "A maid does not have a family, Calvin. I am just giving my notice." I slid into the plush leather seat of the Maybach. Richard climbed in beside me, and the driver immediately pulled away from the curb, leaving Calvin, Vivian, and Malik standing on the lawn in stunned, humiliated silence. The interior of the car was completely soundproof, a quiet sanctuary rolling away from the suburban nightmare. Richard poured a glass of sparkling water from the console and handed it to me. "I suggest you open the envelope," he said gently. My hands were steady as I broke the wax seal. I pulled out a stack of crisp official documents bearing the crest of a premier genetic testing laboratory. I flipped to the summary page. The bold black letters jumped off the paper, burning themselves into my mind. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. I stared at the names listed below the percentage. My name Zuri alongside the name of the man who had submitted the rush sample overnight. Isaiah Montgomery. My breath caught in my throat. I was not an unwanted orphan dumped at a church. I was not a charity case meant to scrub floors and serve a fake tech entrepreneur. The offshore accounts I had secretly built were just a drop in the ocean compared to this reality. I was the stolen, long-lost daughter of the most powerful African-American real estate mogul in the country. I was the sole heiress to the Montgomery Empire. Richard watched me process the information, a small smile touching his lips. Your father has been tearing the world apart looking for you for 25 years, Zuri, and he is very eager to meet the woman you have become. The Maybach glided smoothly through a pair of towering wrought iron gates, winding its way up a pristine, tree-lined driveway until it stopped in front of a sprawling modern estate of glass and stone. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle, my worn-out sneakers crunching loudly against the white gravel. Richard led me through massive double doors into a sun-drenched study overlooking the churning ocean. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window was a man whose face I had only ever seen on the covers of international financial magazines, Isaiah Montgomery. He turned around as we entered. For a long moment, the room was absolutely silent. Neither of us dared to breathe. He possessed the same sharp jawline, the same intense, deep brown eyes that I saw in my own mirror every single morning. He crossed the expansive room in 3 long strides, his broad shoulders shaking. His hands trembled as he reached out, stopping just an inch from my face, as if he was afraid I was a mirage that would shatter. His eyes scanned my face and immediately locked onto the fading, angry red handprint Vivian had left on my cheek. He looked at the frayed, cheap collar of my cotton shirt and the thick calluses on my hands from years of scrubbing floors with harsh chemicals. A tear slipped down his face, a stark, jarring contrast to his ruthless corporate reputation. "You are home," he whispered, his voice cracking with 25 years of suppressed grief. He pulled me into a desperate, crushing hug. I closed my eyes and let my head rest against his shoulder, absorbing the solid warmth of a father's embrace, something I had never once experienced in my entire life. But that tender, fragile moment shattered the second we sat down on the leather sofas, and I explained exactly where I had been. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away all emotion as I described the windowless basement room at the parsonage, the daily grueling chores, the public humiliations, and the way Calvin and Vivian used their church congregation as a shield for their private cruelty. I told him about Malik the golden boy and fake tech genius, and how I was constantly forced to hand over my meager earnings to fund his extravagant lifestyle, while they publicly claimed I was a troubled, ungrateful charity case. Isaiah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. The profound grief in his eyes instantly hardened into pure, lethal rage. A pastor he spat out, pacing the room like a caged panther ready to strike. A so-called man of God stole my daughter, enslaved her in a damp basement, and turned her into an unpaid maid for his worthless son. He spun around to face Richard, who was standing quietly by the heavy oak doors. "Call the Federal Bureau right now. Call the governor. Get a tactical unit down to that church immediately. I want Calvin and Vivian in handcuffs before noon. I want them charged with federal kidnapping, child labor violations, and grand larceny. I want them publicly destroyed." He reached for his phone on the desk, fully prepared to wipe my abusers off the map with a single command. I stood up and walked over to him, placing my hand firmly over his. He froze, looking down at me in absolute surprise. I did not flinch or look away. "Jail is too easy, Dad," I said calmly, testing the word on my tongue for the very first time. It felt right. Federal prison provides 3 meals a day and a warm bed. If you arrest them now, they will just play the victims. They will cry to the media, claim they rescued a poor orphan from the streets, and manipulate their devoted congregation into paying their massive legal fees. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a cool, calculating register. They think I am a maid. Let them keep thinking that. Let them believe they still have all the power. Isaiah slowly lowered his phone, his chest heaving as he stared at me. He studied my face closely, seeing past the cheap, oversized clothes and the bruised cheek. He recognized the cold, strategic intellect staring back at him. It was the exact same predator instinct that had built the Montgomery Empire. "What exactly do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intrigued whisper. I walked over to the cheap duffel bag Vivian had thrown onto the lawn just an hour ago. I bypassed the faded shirts and jeans and reached into a hidden reinforced bottom compartment. I pulled out a sleek military-grade encrypted laptop. I carried it over and set it down heavily on Isaiah's massive mahogany desk. I flipped it open and the screen flared to life, casting a sharp blue glow over my face. I typed in a complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords, bypassing multiple firewalls, until a highly classified corporate dashboard materialized on the screen. They think I spent the last 5 years taking out the trash and scrubbing toilets at commercial office buildings, I explained, my fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. And technically, I did. But I was not emptying wastebaskets. I was taking out corporate trash. I used the cleaning job as a cover to leave the parsonage every day, change into a tailored suit at a gym down the street, and ruin corrupt executives. I turned the laptop so Isaiah and Richard could clearly see the screen. The glowing gold and black logo of Apex Vanguard, the most ruthless and powerful venture capital firm on the East Coast, slowly rotated at the top of the dashboard. Directly beneath it was my official security clearance and title, Zuri Montgomery, Senior Forensic Auditor. Isaiah let out a low whistle, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. I clicked on a pending red-flagged file marked Urgent Priority. It was a massive, highly detailed loan application requesting $5 million. The applicant was Malik's heavily hyped tech startup. Malik has been begging Vanguard for this capital to fund his lavish lifestyle, his luxury cars, and his upcoming island wedding to Chloe, I said smoothly, tapping the screen. He submitted doctored profit margins, inflated user acquisition charts, and completely fabricated revenue streams. He thinks Vanguard just relies on automated algorithms to approve these loans. He has absolutely no idea that every single high-risk application lands directly on my desk for final review and approval. I zoomed in on Malik's arrogant digital signature at the bottom of the fraudulent contract. He thinks he is a king, and he thinks I am just the help. But I have his entire financial life by the throat, and I am going to let him hang himself. The sharp blue light of the Vanguard secure server faded from my mind as the bright Sunday morning sun broke over Atlanta. I had given my father and Richard strict instructions to wait. They wanted blood immediately, but corporate executions require precision, patience, and impeccable timing. I needed Malik to dig his own grave so deep that neither his charming smile nor his father's pulpit could save him. The sanctuary of Grace Heritage Church was packed to the rafters. I stood in the heavy oak vestibule at the back of the church, listening to Pastor Calvin's voice boom through the state-of-the-art sound system. He was pacing the stage, wiping sweat from his forehead with a white embroidered handkerchief, delivering a fiery sermon on the blessings of family values and generational wealth. The congregation, mostly hardworking elderly men and women who faithfully tithed 10% of their meager fixed incomes, hung on to his every word. God rewards those who walk the righteous path, Calvin shouted, pointing dramatically to the front pew. Just look at my son Malik, a visionary, a pioneer. Tomorrow he secures a massive investment to expand his technology company. He is bringing millions into our community. Give the Lord a hand of praise for this young man. The congregation erupted into applause. From my vantage point in the shadows, I could see Malik standing up, buttoning his tailored designer jacket, and waving to the crowd with practiced, humble arrogance. Chloe sat right beside him, her cubic zirconia engagement ring flashing under the sanctuary lights, soaking up the admiration of the very people she secretly despised. Vivian sat on his other side, fanning herself, playing the role of the ultimate proud, blessed mother. It was a flawless, sickening performance. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the light of the sanctuary. I was not wearing my drab gray cleaning uniform. I wore a simple tailored black dress, my posture perfectly straight. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, drawing the attention of the ushers stationed in the back rows. Vivian happened to glance over her shoulder. Her proud, beaming smile collapsed instantly. Her face drained of color before flushing with absolute fury. She frantically elbowed Calvin, who stumbled over his next Bible verse as he caught sight of me standing in the center aisle. Vivian snapped her fingers, catching the eye of Brother Thomas, the burly head usher. She made a sharp, sweeping motion with her hand, a clear directive to throw me out of the building. Thomas marched up the aisle toward me, his face set in a stern grimace. But I did not retreat. I did not cower. I walked directly toward him holding a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with the gold crest of Apex Vanguard. When Thomas reached out to grab my arm, I dodged his grasp and raised my voice, pitching it to carry over the quiet murmur of the confused congregation. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt this holy service, Pastor Calvin," I called out, feigning a perfect tone of submission and urgency. My voice echoed through the massive room, forcing the organ player to stop the background music entirely. The entire church turned around in their pews to stare at me. Vivian stood up, her chest heaving. "Get her out of here," she hissed at the ushers. "She is disturbed." I ignored her completely, walking straight up to the front row until I stood mere inches from Malik. He looked at me with absolute hatred, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "I know I was banished from your home," I said loudly, holding the heavy envelope out to him. "But this was delivered to the parsonage by specialized courier this morning. It says urgent and requires immediate attention. I know how desperate you are for this Apex Vanguard funding, Malik. I just wanted to make sure you got your mail." The mention of the venture capital firm caught the attention of the surrounding deacons. Malik could not create a scene in front of his wealthy fiancée and the church elders. He snatched the envelope from my hands, his eyes burning with silent threats. "Thank you for your service," Zuri, Malik muttered through gritted teeth. "Now leave." I offered a polite, deeply subservient nod, turned on my heel, and walked out of the sanctuary. I did not look back. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Inside that envelope was a meticulously crafted, fully authenticated pre-approval letter from Apex Vanguard. It stated that Malik's tech startup was approved for a $5 million corporate expansion loan. But nestled on the second page, buried under complex financial jargon that I knew Malik's inflated ego would never allow him to read properly, was a deadly hidden clause. The loan required an immediate showing of liquid collateral matching 40% of the total loan value. $2 million in cash equivalents held in escrow to secure the funds. I had also added a fake expiration clause. The pre-approval would be permanently revoked if the collateral agreement was not signed and faxed back to Vanguard within 24 hours. I sat in the back of my father's Maybach, parked discreetly across the street from the church, and watched the rest of the trap spring shut through my encrypted dashboard. After the service concluded, while Calvin and Vivian were busy shaking hands and accepting praises in the lobby, Malik rushed straight into his father's private pastoral office. My dashboard tracked his login credentials the moment he accessed the church's private network. He was panicking. He had promised Chloe a $50,000 honeymoon. He had promised the yacht dealer a massive deposit. He had a fake startup built on air, and he suddenly needed $2 million in collateral by Monday morning to make his billionaire dreams come true. Malik was a creature of intense greed and zero foresight. He did exactly what I calculated he would do. He opened the digital ledger for the Grace Heritage Church Pension Fund. It was an account built over 30 years, holding the life savings and retirement funds of the elderly congregation members who had just applauded him. The current balance was exactly $2.1 million. The fund required the signatures of the 3 senior deacons to authorize any transfers. But Malik did not care about the deacons. He did not care about the elderly widows who relied on that money to survive. Blinded by the promise of $5 million, he downloaded the Vanguard collateral agreement I had placed in the envelope. Sitting at his father's desk, he boldly forged the signatures of the church's deacon board, illegally authorizing the transfer of the entire pension fund to serve as collateral for his personal business loan. A notification chimed softly on my laptop screen in the back of the Maybach. Document received, signature verified, collateral secured. I smiled, closing the laptop with a satisfying click. Malik had just committed massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement in a single stroke of a pen. He had bypassed the deacon board and tied the church's entire future to a tech startup that was legally bleeding to death. He thought he was outsmarting the system. He thought he had finally secured his crown. He had no idea he had just handed the executioner his own rope. The post-service celebratory brunch at the Kensington Country Club was a masterclass in performative wealth. Nestled behind towering wrought iron gates and acres of manicured emerald golf courses, the club was an impenetrable fortress of old money and generational privilege. It was a predominantly white, fiercely exclusive establishment where membership was inherited, never bought. Calvin and Vivian had spent years desperately trying to claw their way into this exact social circle, and Malik's engagement to Chloe Kensington was their golden ticket. On the sprawling outdoor patio, a string quartet played a soft classical melody, while waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne. Calvin stood near the ice sculpture wearing a garish plaid suit, laughing entirely too loudly at a joke told by one of the club board members. Vivian fluttered around the VIP tables, adjusting her oversized designer hat and acting as though she owned the entire estate. Malik sat at the center of the main table, swirling a glass of imported scotch, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the world. He had no idea the financial noose was already tightening around his neck. I stepped onto the flagstone patio, leaving the tinted windows of my father's Maybach behind in the valet line. I was no longer wearing the faded cotton shirts and worn-out sneakers Vivian had thrown onto the church lawn. I wore a tailored emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly across my frame, paired with imported leather stilettos that commanded attention with every step. My hair was styled flawlessly, and my posture was straight, unbroken by years of their psychological torment. Vivian spotted me first. She was mid-sip of her mimosa when her eyes locked onto me across the patio. She nearly choked, coughing loudly into a linen napkin as her face drained of all color. She grabbed Calvin by the arm, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve, and pointed frantically in my direction. Calvin's eyes widened in sheer panic. He immediately assumed I had bypassed the security gates to beg for my old basement room, or to publicly embarrass them in front of their wealthy hosts. In their deeply delusional minds, I was still the helpless maid they had discarded. They whispered furiously to each other, likely assuming I had snuck in through the service entrance and borrowed a nice dress just to cater the event. I ignored their panicked stares and walked directly toward the main VIP table, situated at the edge of the patio overlooking the 18th hole. Chloe Kensington was lounging in a plush wicker chair, scrolling through her phone, completely ignoring Malik, who was busy boasting about his fake tech startup to her wealthy cousins. Chloe caught a glimpse of my shadow falling across her screen. Without even bothering to look up, she saw a black woman standing near her table and immediately fell back on her entitled, deeply ingrained assumptions. "You there," Chloe snapped, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Fetch me another mimosa. And make sure the champagne is actually cold this time. The service here has been absolutely dreadful all morning." Vivian scurried over her face, flushed with a mixture of terror and rage. She intended to grab me by the arm and drag me out before I could cause a scene, but I moved faster. I stepped past Vivian, pulled out the high-backed chair directly across from Chloe, and sat down at the VIP table. I crossed my legs smoothly, resting my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. The entire table fell dead silent. Malik stopped mid-sentence, his jaw dropping open as he stared at me in absolute horror. "I am not fetching you anything, Chloe," I said, my voice calm, melodic, and laced with absolute authority. "But I will offer you a piece of free advice." Chloe finally looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing as she took in my designer dress and the utter lack of subservience in my posture. "Excuse me," she sneered, her voice pitching higher. "Who do you think you are sitting at my table? Malik, get this caterer out of my face right now." Malik stood up, his chair scraping violently against the stone patio. "Zuri," he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Get out of here before I have security throw you onto the street." I leaned forward, completely ignoring Malik, and focused my gaze entirely on the massive glittering stone on Chloe's left hand. She had been flashing it all morning, desperate to prove her worth to her old money relatives. "You should really have that ring appraised, Chloe," I said smoothly, tapping my manicured finger against the table. "I know Malik sold you a wonderful story about a custom-cut diamond to celebrate his upcoming tech millions. But natural diamonds have a very specific refractive index. They reflect light in shades of gray and white. Your stone is casting tiny rainbows across the linen tablecloth. That high dispersion rate is a textbook optical property of cubic zirconia. Chloe froze. The color rushed out of her face as she looked down at her ring, then up at Malik. It is completely flawless. I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the suddenly quiet patio. And that is the problem. Natural stones have microscopic inclusions. Yours is a factory-made piece of glass, mounted on cheap sterling silver. Malik did not buy you a $50,000 engagement ring, Chloe. He bought you a $200 prop to maintain his illusion. The silence on the patio was deafening. Chloe's wealthy relatives began whispering among themselves, casting judgmental, disgusted looks at Malik. Vivian covered her mouth with both hands, completely mortified, as her grand high society illusion shattered into a million pieces. Malik's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. The carefully constructed mask of the charming, successful entrepreneur completely disintegrated, revealing the violent, desperate fraud underneath. "Shut your mouth," Malik roared, losing all control. He lunged across the table, knocking over a crystal pitcher of water, and grabbed my arm with a bruising, vicious grip. "I am going to drag you out of here myself." Before he could pull me out of my chair, a commanding, thunderous voice echoed across the patio, stopping Malik dead in his tracks. "Take your hand off my personal guest immediately." The entire country club turned to look. Richard Kensington strode across the patio, his presence commanding absolute silence and respect. The billionaire patriarch of the Kensington family moved with a lethal grace, flanked by two massive security guards. He did not look like a man hosting a casual brunch. He looked like a king preparing to execute a traitor. Malik instantly dropped my arm as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, his hands raised in surrender, his chest heaving with panic. "Mr. Kensington," Malik stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Sir, you do not understand. This woman is deranged. She used to clean our house. She snuck in here to harass your daughter." Richard stopped right beside my chair. He looked down at Malik with a gaze so cold and full of disgust that the younger man physically shrank back. "She did not sneak in anywhere," Richard stated, his voice booming with authority. "Zuri is sitting exactly where she belongs. She is my guest of honor." Vivian and Calvin stood paralyzed near the ice sculpture, visibly shaking. They looked from Richard to me, their minds completely failing to comprehend the scene unfolding before them. Their entire world was collapsing, and they were left sweating in the summer heat, desperately wondering why one of the most powerful billionaires in the country was fiercely protecting the woman they had treated like a stray dog. Malik could not get out of the Kensington Country Club fast enough. His face burned with a humiliation so profound it left him physically shaking as he shoved his way past the valet stand. Vivian and Calvin trailed behind him in a panicked, frantic silence. The illusion of their high society dominance had been shattered by the very girl they kept locked in their basement. They did not speak a single word on the drive back to the parsonage. Their minds were entirely consumed by the terrifying reality that I was not a helpless maid, but a guest of honor to a billionaire. They needed a victory, a massive stroke of luck to restore their fragile egos and prove they still belonged in the upper echelons of society. They placed all their desperate hopes on Malik's tech loan. Monday morning arrived. I sat in my corner office on the top floor of the Apex Vanguard building, sipping black coffee as I monitored the secure internal network. I had already set the trap. At exactly 9 o'clock, an automated email chimed in Malik's inbox at his rented luxury office suite. The Vanguard crest glowed at the top of his screen. Underneath it was a single beautiful line of text confirming that a $5 million corporate expansion wire had been initiated to his primary business account. I watched his login activity spike on my dashboard. Malik did not bother to check the actual clearing status with his banking institution. He did not notice the tiny encrypted routing codes I had embedded in the digital document, which explicitly flagged the transfer as a phantom placeholder pending a federal asset verification. He saw the string of zeros and let out a victorious, unhinged laugh. He believed he had won. He believed the money was real, and his greed immediately blinded him to basic financial protocols. Malik picked up his phone and began making calls determined to erase the humiliation of the country club by acting like the titan of industry he pretended to be. First on his list was the yacht broker in Miami. Malik authorized a $200,000 non-refundable deposit on a sleek 70-foot vessel for his upcoming honeymoon. He secured a temporary high-interest bridge loan to cover the immediate deposit simply by flashing the forged Vanguard pre-approval letter to a predatory private lender. Next, he visited a luxury European auto dealership downtown. He leased two brand-new top-of-the-line sports cars, one for himself and one for Chloe. He signed the exorbitant financing paperwork without reading a single line, leveraging his phantom millions to push the deal through. He then drove straight to a premier Diamond District jeweler. Desperate to replace the cubic zirconia I had publicly exposed, he put a staggering down payment on a flawless 5-carat emerald-cut diamond. He was spending money he did not actually possess, building a massive mountain of debt on a foundation of digital air. The contagion of greed spread instantly to his mother. Vivian returned to the parsonage still seething from the country club incident. She refused to be outdone by the Kensington family. She marched into Calvin's home office, unlocked his desk drawer, and took out the black corporate credit cards tied directly to the Grace Heritage Church operating and emergency accounts. Calvin tried to protest, warning her that those cards were strictly for church emergencies, outreach programs, and facility maintenance. Vivian snapped at him, declaring that God was finally blessing their family through Malik. She convinced Calvin that Malik was now a multimillionaire and would easily replenish the church accounts by Friday. It was not stealing, she reasoned, it was just a temporary divine advance. Vivian drove straight to the luxury boutiques in Buckhead. I tracked every single swipe through the financial monitoring software I had linked to their public records. She maxed out 3 different church credit cards in a single afternoon. She purchased custom designer gowns, imported silk shoes, and diamond accessories for the wedding. She bought expensive tailored suits for Calvin. She paraded through the stores like royalty, completely oblivious to the financial crater opening up beneath her feet. The church's emergency funds were drained in hours traded for silk and vanity. By Thursday afternoon, the intoxicating high of their spending spree began to curdle into a cold, creeping dread. Malik was sitting at a waterfront restaurant with Chloe, boasting about their new cars, when his phone rang. It was the yacht dealer from Miami. The man was absolutely furious. The bridge loan had collapsed upon routine auditing, and the secondary deposit Malik had attempted to push through his personal bank had bounced hard. The dealer threatened to call the police and file charges for fraud if the funds were not secured by the end of the day. Malik hung up, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He forced a tight smile, for Chloe muttered a pathetic excuse about a minor banking error and sprinted to his car. He drove recklessly to his private banking branch, his tires screeching as he pulled into the parking lot. He marched through the heavy glass doors, demanding to speak to the branch manager immediately. He was sweating through his designer shirt, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by a frantic, breathless desperation. He slammed his Vanguard approval printout onto the polished mahogany desk of the bank manager. "I have $5 million sitting in the wire queue," Malik shouted, his voice cracking as other customers turned to stare. "I need a manual override right now. Clear the funds. Release the money to my accounts. People are threatening to arrest me over bounced deposits." The branch manager did not flinch. He calmly adjusted his glasses and typed Malik's account number into the system. The manager's face went completely slack. He stopped typing and slowly pulled his hands away from the keyboard, as if the computer itself had become toxic. He looked up at Malik, his expression devoid of any customer service warmth. "I cannot clear anything, Mr. Calvin," the manager stated, his voice dropping to a serious, chilling register. "Your business accounts, your personal accounts, and the Grace Heritage Church pension fund you listed as collateral have all been frozen by federal authorities." Malik gripped the edge of the desk, the room suddenly spinning around him. Frozen, he gasped, all the air leaving his lungs. "On what grounds?" The manager turned the monitor slightly so Malik could see the glaring red lock icon flashing across his entire financial portfolio. The bank received a direct mandate from Apex Vanguard's Internal Auditing Division 30 minutes ago, the manager said coldly. You are currently under active investigation for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the embezzlement of $2 million. Malik could not breathe. The walls of the bank manager's office closed in around him. He stumbled out of the leather chair, his vision swimming, and bolted for the exit. He dialed Vivian, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped his phone in the parking lot. Within an hour, Malik and Vivian were standing outside a dilapidated brick apartment building on the wrong side of town. It was the address I had listed on my mandatory background check paperwork years ago. It was a cheap rundown studio I rented for $500 a month specifically to maintain the illusion of my poverty. I never actually slept there, but I knew they would come looking for me. I was waiting inside, sitting on a sagging thrift store sofa holding my phone. The frantic pounding on the thin wooden door echoed through the tiny room. I stood up, smoothed down the cheap cotton shirt I had changed into, and unlocked the deadbolt. Malik shoved the door open so hard it slammed against the drywall. He stormed into the room, his eyes wide and wild, sweating through his expensive designer suit. Vivian marched in right behind him, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. They looked completely out of place in the dingy studio, surrounded by peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. "You are going to fix this right now," Malik screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to pick up your phone call, whatever low-level manager you report to at Vanguard, and tell them you made a clerical error. You are going to tell them you accidentally flagged my account." Vivian slammed her designer purse onto a scratched wooden table. "You owe us your life, Zuri," she hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to me. "We pulled you out of the gutter. We put food in your mouth when nobody else wanted you. Now you are going to repay that debt. You are going to take the fall for this little banking misunderstanding. You are going to sign a sworn statement saying you mixed up the church routing numbers with Malik's business accounts because you are incompetent." I took a slow step back, adopting the timid, fearful posture they expected from me. I kept my hands behind my back, my thumb resting securely on the record button of my smartphone. "I do not understand Malik," I said, making my voice tremble perfectly. "How could I possibly mix up the accounts? How did the Grace Heritage Church pension fund get tied to your personal tech loan?" Malik let out an exasperated, furious groan, completely blinded by his own panic and arrogance. "Because Vanguard demanded collateral, you idiot," he yelled, throwing his hands in the air. "I needed $2 million in liquid assets to secure the $5 million wire. I used the church pension fund. It was just a temporary hold. I signed the transfer authorization myself." "But what about the deacon board?" I asked softly, baiting the trap further. "Do they not have to sign off on moving the retirement funds of the entire congregation?" Vivian scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes with absolute disgust. "Those old fools do not know how to manage real money," she snapped, entirely missing the danger of her own words. "Malik is the future of that church. He is the pastor's son. He had every right to bypass the board and leverage that stagnant money to build his empire. It is family money anyway. He signed their names and he did what he had to do. It was a victimless transfer until you and your idiot supervisors flagged it. Now you are going to take the blame for the forgery." I dropped the fearful posture instantly. I stood up straight, letting the cold, calculating reality of who I truly was wash over my features. I looked at them, not as my abusers, but as two pathetic criminals caught in a trap of their own making. "I am not taking the fall for federal wire fraud," I said, my voice dropping its manufactured tremble and replacing it with pure ice. "And I am certainly not going to prison for your sloppy embezzlement." Vivian's face darkened. The vicious, abusive woman who had terrorized me in the parsonage basement flared to life. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, waving it in my face like a weapon. "You will do exactly as we say, Zuri," she threatened, her voice dropping to a malicious whisper. "Do you think I am stupid? Do you think I would let a stray dog live in my house without keeping a leash on its neck?" She unfolded the paper and shoved it toward me. It was a background check printout. For years I have been taking out credit cards in your name. Vivian gloated, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. I bounced checks using your social security number. I created a shadow financial history that makes you look like a desperate, reckless thief. You have a criminal paper trail you do not even know about. If you do not call Vanguard right now and take the blame for Malik's loan, I will hand this file over to the police. Who do you think they will believe? A respected pastor's wife or a penniless maid with a history of financial fraud? The silence in the dingy apartment was absolute. Malik smirked, crossing his arms, fully believing they had just checkmated me. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg for their mercy. Instead, I looked at the piece of paper, then looked at Vivian, and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of fear, ringing with genuine amusement. Vivian frowned, her triumphant smile faltering. "What is so funny?" she demanded. I brought my hands out from behind my back. I held up my smartphone. The screen was brightly lit, displaying an active voice recording app. The audio wave had been capturing every single word spoken in that room for the last 10 minutes. "You did not create a leash, Vivian," I said smoothly, tapping the screen to stop the recording. "You created a confession. You just admitted to years of identity theft and credit fraud. And Malik just confessed to forging the signatures of the deacon board to embezzle $2 million from a church pension fund." Malik's face went completely white. He lunged forward desperately, trying to snatch the phone from my hands, but I stepped smoothly out of his reach. "Do not bother Malik," I said, my thumb hovering over the screen. "This file is already backed up to a secure cloud server. And I think the authorities will be very interested to hear a respected pastor's wife and her genius tech son detail exactly how they stole the life savings of their entire congregation." I looked right into Vivian's terrified, wide eyes. I smiled, pressed the screen, and hit send. The audio file transmitted instantly, flying straight to the anonymous tip line of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The game was over. I walked out of that suffocating studio apartment, leaving Malik and Vivian standing in stunned, terrified silence. I climbed into the back of my waiting car and opened my laptop. The spyware I had previously installed on Malik's phone during my days as their captive maid was still actively transmitting every keystroke, location, ping, and audio feed. I slipped my earpiece in just in time to hear the glorious sound of Chloe Kensington's entire reality crashing down around her. Chloe was across town at an exclusive bridal boutique in Buckhead, surrounded by imported French lace and fawning attendants. She was attempting to pay the final $30,000 balance on her custom wedding gown using the new platinum card Malik had given her. It was the card tied directly to his frozen Vanguard account. Through the audio feed, I heard the sharp, unpleasant beep of the credit card terminal. Declined. Chloe scoffed loudly, blaming the machine, and handed over a different card. Declined again. The fawning silence of the boutique staff quickly morphed into a heavy, judgmental quiet. Chloe Kensington, heiress to a real estate fortune, was standing in a high-end bridal shop with maxed-out frozen cards. Her voice pitched into a shrill, humiliated shriek as she stormed out of the boutique, demanding the valet bring her car immediately. She drove straight to Malik's rented luxury office suite. I tracked her GPS dot, moving aggressively fast down the interstate. When she threw open his office door, the screaming match that erupted was nothing short of spectacular. Malik was still reeling from my apartment, pacing the floor, likely trying to figure out how to flee the country. Chloe did not care about his visible panic. She threw the useless plastic cards directly at his chest. "My cards declined at Bergdorf's and the bridal salon," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing sharply through my earpiece. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? My father's associates were in that store. What is going on with your money, Malik?" Malik, a coward to his core, desperately tried to maintain his lie. "It is a glitch," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "It is just a stupid banking glitch. Apex Vanguard put a temporary security freeze on the wire transfer because of the sheer volume of the transaction. $5 million triggers automatic federal holds. I'm sorting it out right now." "You are not sorting out anything," Chloe snapped back, completely devoid of any sympathy. "I am not going to be embarrassed like some low-class grifter. I will go down to Vanguard myself." My father plays golf with their parent company's board of directors. I will have the managing director fired and your account unfrozen by noon. I smiled, pulling the earpiece out. I gave my driver the signal to head to the Apex Vanguard downtown headquarters. I needed to beat Chloe there. I sat behind the massive, polished mahogany desk in the corner office on the 50th floor. The room smelled of rich leather, expensive espresso, and success. I wore a bespoke $5,000 charcoal suit that cut a sharp, commanding silhouette. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, no-nonsense style. The Vanguard security feeds on my dual monitors showed Chloe's leased sports car screeching into the VIP parking area. She marched through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, completely ignoring the security protocol. She bypassed the waiting area and slammed her hand flat against the marble reception desk. The audio from the lobby camera piped directly into my office. "I am Chloe Kensington," she announced, her voice dripping with venom and white privilege. "My fiancé, Malik Calvin, has a $5 million corporate account that your incompetent bank has frozen due to some pathetic system glitch. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this delay immediately, or my father will have this entire branch liquidated by the end of the business day." The receptionist, a seasoned professional who I had briefed exactly 5 minutes prior, did not even blink. She typed calmly on her keyboard, her expression completely neutral. "Of course, Ms. Kensington," the receptionist said smoothly. "A freeze of that magnitude falls under our Federal Compliance Division. You need to speak with our head of risk management and asset verification. Top floor, corner office. They have been expecting you." Chloe snatched her designer purse off the counter and marched toward the private executive elevators, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. I watched her ascend on the monitors, tracking her progress as she stepped onto the 50th floor. She did not bother to pause in the antechamber or speak to my executive assistant. She strode down the hushed, carpeted hallway, her sense of entitlement propelling her forward like a battering ram. She threw open the heavy frosted glass door to my office without knocking, already mid-rant. "Listen to me, whoever you are," Chloe snapped, marching into the center of the room. "You are going to lift the hold on Malik Calvin's account this exact second, or I will personally see to it that you never work in finance again." Her voice abruptly died in her throat. The color drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. She stopped dead in the center of the plush Persian rug, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated shock. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms over my tailored suit, and met her horrified gaze with a cool, predatory smile. I did not say a word. I just sat there waiting for the reality of her situation to finally sink in. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The sheer impossibility of the scene before her caused her brain to temporarily short-circuit. She looked at my pristine tailored suit, the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline behind me, and the heavy gold nameplate on the desk that clearly read, "Zuri Washington, Managing Director of Risk Assessment." The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds before Chloe finally found her voice. When she did, it was laced with the shrill, arrogant entitlement she had possessed her entire life. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Chloe demanded, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "How did you get up here? Did you steal that suit from the executive locker room? Get out of that chair right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not move a single muscle. I simply steepled my fingers together and watched her throw her tantrum. "I demand to speak to a real manager," Chloe shouted, her face flushing an angry crimson. "A real executive, not some pathetic, disgruntled maid who broke into a corporate office to play pretend. I am calling the police. I am calling building security. You are going to leave this building in handcuffs." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her phone, her manicured thumbs flying across the screen. I watched her dial the first 2 numbers of the emergency line. "I would not do that if I were you, Chloe Kensington," I said. My voice was calm, melodic, and entirely devoid of fear. It cut through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. Chloe froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. She glared at me, her chest heaving. And why exactly shouldn't I? I reached beneath the heavy mahogany desk and pressed the small security button hidden near the drawer. A loud, heavy metallic click echoed through the room. The reinforced glass doors locked instantly, sealing us inside. Chloe spun around, staring at the door in sudden panic before whipping her head back toward me. Because if you call the police to this office, I said smoothly, they are going to ask why you are here. And when you tell them you are here to unfreeze Malik Calvin's accounts, they are going to inform you that your fiancé is currently the primary target of a massive federal wire fraud investigation. And since your name is currently listed on the lease of 2 luxury vehicles purchased with those fraudulent funds, you will be leaving in handcuffs right alongside him. Chloe lowered her phone slowly. The color began to drain from her cheeks, leaving her designer makeup looking harsh and artificial against her pale skin. You are lying, she stammered, though the absolute terror in her eyes told me she already knew I was not. Malik is a genius. He is a successful tech developer. Vanguard made a mistake. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a massive 200-page bound dossier. It was thick, heavy, and packed with every piece of digital evidence I had meticulously collected over the last 6 months. I dropped it onto the polished wood with a loud, satisfying thud, then slid it directly across the desk until it bumped against Chloe's hands. Open it, I commanded. Chloe stared at the black binder as if it were a venomous snake. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly as she reached out and flipped open the cover. Malik does not own a tech startup, I explained, my voice echoing in the quiet room as she stared at the first page. He owns a shell company registered in Delaware. He has 0 employees, 0 active software patents, and absolutely 0 revenue. His entire business model consists of leasing servers and printing glossy brochures to trick old men at his father's church into giving him money. Chloe flipped to the next section, her breath catching in her throat. She was looking at a spreadsheet consisting of bright red negative numbers. Your charming fiancé has a massive, crippling gambling addiction, I continued mercilessly. Those weekend investor meetings in Las Vegas and Atlantic City were nothing but high-stakes poker binges. He owes $3 million to a network of offshore bookies and private, highly unregulated lenders. They have been threatening to break his legs for a month. That is why he was so desperate to marry you. He does not love you, Chloe. He loves your father's checkbook. You are just his exit strategy. Tears began to pool in Chloe's eyes as she frantically turned the pages. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream at me and call me a liar, but the bank statements, the tracking logs, and the forged documents were staring her right in the face. Turn to page 112, I instructed softly. Chloe's trembling fingers found the page. She gasped out loud, dropping the binder onto the desk and covering her mouth with her hand. Staring up at her from the glossy photograph was Malik, smiling brightly, holding a toddler on his shoulders. Standing next to him was a beautiful woman wearing a diamond ring. That is his second family, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of her perfect life. They live in a townhouse in Chicago. He has been paying their rent using the church outreach funds. The little boy just turned 3. Chloe collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, completely defeated. The arrogant, wealthy heiress who had ordered me to fetch her a mimosa just 2 days ago was gone. In her place was a humiliated, terrified woman realizing she had been conned by a masterful predator. Tomorrow is your wedding day, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk. You are scheduled to stand in front of 500 high society guests and bind yourself to that man. The second you sign that marriage license, the state considers his debts to be marital property. You will immediately assume liability for half of his $3 million deficit. His bookies will come after your trust fund. The federal government will freeze your assets. Your father's pristine reputation will be dragged through the mud on the front page of every financial newspaper in the country. Chloe looked up at me, mascara running down her cheeks. What do I do? She whispered, her voice completely broken. I smiled, finally revealing the true depth of my plan. I am giving you a choice, Chloe. You can walk out of that door, put on your expensive white dress tomorrow, and go down with his sinking ship. Or you can walk away from the marriage right now and help me annihilate him. Chloe wiped her face, her sadness rapidly hardening into a furious, vengeful rage. She was a Kensington. She had been publicly humiliated, lied to, and used for her money. She wanted blood just as much as I did. How she asked, her voice turning cold. Tonight is the rehearsal dinner at the country club, I said smoothly. His entire family will be there. His parents will be strutting around bragging about their newfound wealth. I want to walk into that private dining room and tear his life apart in front of every single person he cares about. But the club is highly secure. I need your security clearance to get inside the private banquet hall. Chloe looked down at the dossier again. She stared at the red numbers, the forged documents, and the photograph of the secret child. She closed the binder with a sharp snap and looked back up at me. The entitlement was gone, replaced by a ruthless, absolute determination. "I will get you through the front door," Chloe said, her eyes burning with vengeance. "Bring everything you have. We are going to destroy him." I watched Chloe march out of my office, a woman transformed from a pampered, oblivious bride into an instrument of absolute ruin. The heavy, frosted glass doors slid shut behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet, temperature-controlled hum of the 50th floor. The first domino had been pushed. Now it was time to sit back and watch the rest of them fall. Across town, panic was spreading through the Calvin household like a rabid infection. My surveillance feeds were still active, piping the frantic, unfiltered sounds of the parsonage living room directly into my headset. Vivian was pacing the hardwood floor, her heavy heels striking the wood in a rapid, erratic rhythm that betrayed her mounting terror. Pastor Calvin was sitting in his leather armchair, hyperventilating as he stared at his laptop screen. The reality of their situation had finally breached their arrogant delusions. The $5 million wire from Vanguard was permanently frozen. The church pension fund was gone. And Malik had just called them babbling incoherently about federal agents and offshore bookies closing in. "We need liquid cash right now," Vivian shrieked, her voice completely stripped of its usual Sunday morning sweetness. "If Malik does not pay those people by tomorrow, they are going to kill him. And if the deacon board finds out the pension is gone, we are going to federal prison. We need to get him out of the country tonight." Pastor Calvin ran his trembling hands over his face, sweat beading heavily on his forehead. "There is no cash left, Vivian," he groaned, staring blankly at the wall as his empire crumbled. "We leveraged everything to prop up his fake company. The church accounts are drained. My personal accounts are overdrawn. We have absolutely nothing." Vivian stopped pacing. The audio feed went dead quiet for a long, heavy moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was a chilling, calculating whisper. "We have the buildings." Pastor Calvin gasped loudly, the sound vibrating through my earpiece. "You cannot be serious. The historic parsonage and the main sanctuary belong to the congregation. The deacon board holds the titles. We cannot just sell the church." "We do not need to sell it," Vivian snapped, her desperation making her entirely ruthless. "We just need to transfer the deeds into Malik's name. If he holds the physical titles, he can secure a massive hard money loan from an unregulated offshore lender within hours. It will be enough to pay off his bookies and buy him a one-way ticket to Dubai. By the time the congregation realizes they do not own their own church anymore, we will be gone too." "But the paperwork," Pastor Calvin protested weakly, his moral compass completely obliterated by his wife's sheer force of will. "The county clerk requires a signed resolution from the deacon board authorizing the transfer of property, and it has to be notarized." Vivian scoffed, a dark, ugly sound. "I have been forging those old fools' signatures on expense reports for 5 years, she sneered. "I can draft a fake board resolution in 10 minutes. As for the notary, I know a man. He handles discreet paperwork for a few corrupt politicians in the city. For $10,000 in cash, he will stamp anything we put in front of him and backdate it to last month." I listened as the sound of furious, frantic typing filled the audio feed. Vivian and the esteemed Pastor Calvin were actively conspiring to steal the very roof over their congregation's heads. They spent the next hour meticulously forging the signatures of every single senior deacon, legally transferring the multi-million-dollar properties directly into their criminal son's name. An hour later, the audio feed picked up the sound of a bustling coffee shop on the edge of the financial district. Vivian and Pastor Calvin had arranged an emergency meeting with their corrupt notary. I listened as Vivian slid a thick manila envelope across the small cafe table. "The property transfers are inside along with $10,000 in unmarked bills," Vivian whispered urgently. the panic bleeding through her manufactured calm. "We need your official seal on the board resolution backdated to the 4th of last month. Do this quickly and quietly, and we will double your fee before the end of the year." The man across the table cleared his throat. It was a raspy, unremarkable sound. "Consider it done, Mrs. Calvin," the man said smoothly. "The county will have these processed through the automated digital system by 3 o'clock. Have a blessed day." The feed captured the sound of Vivian letting out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. They actually thought they had won. They truly believed they had just bought their son's freedom with the stolen legacy of a 100-year-old church. They were entirely wrong. 45 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors of my Vanguard office opened. Isaiah Montgomery stepped inside carrying that exact manila envelope. Isaiah was a towering, silver-haired man who commanded respect the second he entered a room. He was not just a prominent civil rights attorney in the city. He was the reigning chairman of the Grace Heritage Church Deacon Board. He was also the man I had quietly contacted 6 months ago when I first discovered the Calvins were embezzling church funds. Isaiah walked over to my desk and dropped the envelope in front of me. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, deeply disappointed. "Your private investigator played the role of the corrupt notary perfectly," Zuri Isaiah said, his deep voice rumbling through the quiet office. "He intercepted the meeting, took their bribe money, and brought the documents straight to me." I opened the envelope and pulled out the forged property deeds. The fake signatures of the deacon board were scrawled across the bottom in blue ink. I slid the papers across the desk so Isaiah could see the full extent of their betrayal. "They are not just trying to cover up Malik's missing wire transfer anymore," I said, looking up at the respected chairman. "Vivian and the pastor are legally trying to steal the parsonage and the main sanctuary. They were going to leverage the buildings to fund Malik's escape, and then they were going to abandon the congregation entirely." Isaiah stared at his own forged signature on the fraudulent deed. The betrayal etched deep lines into his weathered face. "For 20 years we trusted that man to shepherd our flock," Isaiah said softly, his voice thick with sorrow. "We brought Vivian into our homes. We celebrated Malik's achievements. And they looked at us like sheep waiting to be slaughtered." He took a slow, deep breath, straightening his posture. The sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by the hardened, razor-sharp focus of a veteran attorney ready to go to war. "Does Chloe Kensington have the security clearance we need for tonight?" Isaiah asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I nodded, tapping the screen of my computer. "Chloe is getting us through the private service entrance at the country club. The rehearsal dinner starts at 8 o'clock. The entire Kensington family will be there, along with the Vanguard board members, the church elders, and the offshore creditors who are currently looking for Malik." Isaiah buttoned his suit jacket, his jaw set like granite. "Keep the original forged deeds in your vault, Zuri. Make high-resolution copies for the presentation. Tonight we do not just fire a pastor. We expose a criminal syndicate. The trap was officially set. The Calvins thought they were walking into a lavish celebration of their newly secured wealth and status. Instead, they were walking blindly into a meticulously designed execution. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a monument to the very arrogance that was about to destroy them. I stood in the darkened vestibule just outside the heavy oak doors, listening to the muffled sounds of clinking crystal and polite laughter. Inside, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing. It was a lavish, sickening display of excess funded entirely by lies and stolen money. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported hydrangeas dominated the tables. A live string quartet played softly in the corner. The guest list was a meticulously curated collection of Atlanta's elite, blending the powerful Kensington real estate dynasty with the wealthy pillars of Grace Heritage Church. Through the crack in the doors, I could see the head table. Chloe sat frozen like a porcelain statue, her face a mask of icy composure, her fingers gripping the stem of her wineglass so tightly her knuckles were white. We had coordinated this perfectly. She had ensured my name and my guest were explicitly added to the master security list under maximum clearance. At the center of the room, Pastor Calvin tapped his fork against his champagne flute. The polite chatter immediately died down. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo, and beamed at the crowd of 500 high society guests. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just pulled off the heist of the century. And why would he not? In his mind, he held the forged, notarized deeds to the church properties. He thought he possessed the key to his son's salvation and his own early, luxurious retirement. Family, friends, and esteemed guests. Pastor Calvin boomed into the microphone, his rich baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Tonight we celebrate more than just a union between two beautiful young people. We celebrate divine favor. We celebrate generational wealth. God has poured his boundless blessings upon my son Malik. Through hard work, unyielding faith, and sheer brilliance, Malik has built an empire. And tomorrow he joins his empire with the esteemed Kensington family. The crowd erupted into warm, polite applause. Vivian sat next to him, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She wore a diamond necklace that likely cost more than a year of my former salary, smiling graciously at the Kensington patriarchs across the table. Malik looked like the cat who swallowed the canary. He raised his glass to the crowd, flashing his charismatic, predatory smile, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was currently standing right outside the door. I did not wait for Pastor Calvin to finish his sickening sermon on divine favor. I placed both hands on the heavy brass handles of the double doors and pushed them open. The doors swung wide with a heavy, dramatic thud that instantly cut through the applause. The string quartet faltered, the cellist missing a note as every head in the massive ballroom turned toward the entrance. I stepped into the brilliant, cascading light of the crystal chandeliers. I was no longer Zuri, the timid, penniless maid in oversized cotton uniforms. I was Zuri Washington, the ruthless executive. I wore a custom floor-length emerald silk gown that hugged my frame flawlessly. A cascade of genuine, flawless diamonds rested against my collarbone, catching the light and throwing brilliant prisms across the room. My hair was styled in an elegant, commanding updo. I did not walk into that room like a guest. I walked in like I owned the building. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. At the head table, Vivian's jaw actually dropped. Her champagne glass tilted dangerously in her hand, spilling expensive liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. Pastor Calvin froze at the microphone, his mouth hanging open mid-sentence, his eyes bulging as he stared at the woman he had treated like an indentured servant for years. But Malik's reaction was the most satisfying of all. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. The charismatic smile vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. For a split second, he looked exactly like the cornered rat he truly was. Then his panic morphed into a desperate, volatile rage. He slammed his glass down on the table so hard the stem snapped. "What is this?" Malik roared, his voice cracking as he lunged forward, knocking his chair backward onto the floor. "How did she get in here?" "Security. Get in here right now." He pointed a shaking finger at me across the crowded room, spit flying from his lips, as he completely lost control of his carefully crafted image in front of his wealthy future in-laws. "Grab her!" Malik screamed, his eyes wild with terror as he looked toward the event staff lining the walls. "She is a crazy stalker. She used to clean our house. She is a thief and a liar. Throw this piece of trash out into the street where she belongs. Call the police." Vivian immediately stood up to join his frantic chorus. "Arrest her!" She shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "She is trespassing. Get her out of my son's rehearsal dinner." Two massive security guards in dark suits stepped forward from the shadows of the vestibule. Malik let out a sharp, triumphant breath, fully expecting them to grab my arms and drag me backward out of the double doors. He expected me to be humiliated. He expected me to be erased. Instead, I did not even flinch. I kept my head held high, my posture radiating absolute chilling calm. The two security guards did not reach for me. They stepped cleanly to the side, flanking me like an honor guard, and snapped to attention. They secured the doors behind them, ensuring that absolutely no one was leaving this room. Malik froze. His frantic screaming died in his throat. Vivian lowered her trembling hand. A wave of confused, terrified murmurs rippled through the 500 guests. Then the heavy sound of deliberate, measured footsteps echoed from the marble hallway outside. A towering, imposing figure stepped through the threshold, stepping directly into the light beside me. It was Isaiah Montgomery. He was not just a successful civil rights attorney. He was the most feared, respected, and powerful man in the city's legal and social circles. He was the chairman of the Grace Heritage Deacon Board. And right now his eyes were locked onto Pastor Calvin and Malik with a level of cold, concentrated fury that made the temperature in the room plummet. Isaiah stepped up beside me, his broad shoulders practically blocking the exit. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, then turned his hardened, lethal gaze directly toward the head table. "Nobody is throwing my daughter out of this room." Isaiah's voice boomed, rumbling through the silent ballroom with the force of a thunderclap. Vivian let out a strangled, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Pastor Calvin staggered backward, physically gripping the edge of the table to keep his knees from buckling. The trap had just slammed shut, and the jaws were made of solid steel. The revelation of Isaiah Montgomery claiming me as his daughter sent a shockwave through the St. Regis ballroom so powerful you could feel it vibrating in the imported crystal glasses. Vivian's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Her meticulously planned narrative of the penniless orphaned maid living in her basement evaporated in an instant. Whispers erupted across the 500 guests like a sudden downpour. Prominent judges, real estate moguls, and church elders exchanged bewildered, horrified glances. Pastor Calvin looked as though he might physically collapse, his knuckles turning white as he clung to the edge of the head table for support. Malik stared at Isaiah, his jaw slack, the realization of his monumental miscalculation dawning on him. But Vivian Calvin was a creature of sheer, desperate survival. When cornered, she attacked. She instantly smoothed her features, forcing tears into her eyes with the practiced ease of a daytime soap actress. She stepped away from her husband and rushed toward the center of the room, throwing her hands up in a gesture of maternal distress. "Please, everyone, do not listen to this!" Vivian cried out, her voice echoing perfectly through the cavernous space. "Isaiah, you are being manipulated. This girl is deeply unwell. We took Zuri in because she was destitute and severely mentally unstable. She has harbored a sick, delusional obsession with my son for years. She is stalking him. She broke into this private event because she simply cannot handle the fact that Malik is marrying Chloe. This is a tragic psychological break, nothing more." The crowd murmured, the high society guests uncertain who to believe. Vivian looked around, playing the compassionate but victimized matriarch to perfection. "We just need to get her medical help." Vivian continued, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "Please, security, just escort her to a hospital. She is completely delusional." I did not scream. I did not defend myself. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a woman who had spent years treating me like a stray dog while stealing from her own congregation. I just looked at Vivian with a smile of pure glacial ice. Then I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers, giving a single sharp nod toward the glass-enclosed audio-visual booth suspended at the back of the ballroom. The lights in the grand hall instantly dimmed. The soft, romantic string quartet was abruptly cut off by the booming, heavy sound of a projector firing up. Behind the head table, an enormous 60-foot digital screen began to descend from the ceiling. It was supposed to display a touching, carefully curated slideshow of Malik and Chloe's fabricated romance, a fairy tale story of two young aristocrats falling in love. Instead, the screen flared to life with blinding white light displaying a massive high-definition spreadsheet. The crowd gasped. The document was a direct feed from Malik's offshore accounts. Every illicit wire transfer, every desperate withdrawal, every failed margin call was magnified for 500 of Atlanta's most powerful people to see. The numbers were staggering, $3 million in the red. Before anyone could fully process the spreadsheet, the image shifted. A series of heavily stamped legal documents flashed across the screen. They were notices of default outstanding liens and desperate correspondence with unregulated private lenders. Then a massive red stamp materialized across the center of the screen, flashing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Bankrupt. Fraud. Malik shrieked like a wounded animal. He vaulted over the head table, scrambling toward the stage, waving his arms frantically at the AV booth. "Turn it off!" Malik bellowed, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch as he desperately tried to block the projector beam with his own body. "It is fake. It is a deep fake." She hacked the system. "None of this is real. I am a tech developer. I have millions in capital. She is a jealous, crazy liar trying to ruin my wedding. Turn the screen off right now." The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. Vanguard board members were pulling out their phones, rapidly texting their compliance departments. Church elders were pointing at the screen in horror, recognizing the routing numbers of their own pension funds tied to Malik's illicit gambling debts. Malik was practically hyperventilating, turning wildly toward his bride, expecting the wealthy, powerful Kensington heiress to step in and save him. Chloe did exactly what we had planned. She stood up slowly from the sweetheart table. She did not look like a blushing bride. She looked like an executioner. She reached forward and calmly unclipped the microphone from the podium stand. The feedback whined sharply, immediately silencing the chaotic room. Every camera phone in the building was now aimed directly at her. Malik looked at her with wide, pleading eyes. "Chloe, baby, tell them," he begged, reaching out a trembling hand. "Tell them it is a lie." Chloe looked down at the man she was supposed to marry in less than 12 hours. She raised the microphone to her lips, her voice echoing with absolute freezing clarity. "They are real," Chloe said, staring right through him. "Every single document on that screen is authentic. You do not own a tech company. You do not have a fortune. You are nothing but a degenerate, thieving parasite who tried to use my father's name to pay off your bookies." Malik staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck. The crowd let out a collective, horrified gasp. Chloe reached for her left hand. She slid the massive, glittering engagement ring off her finger. And by the way, Chloe added, her voice echoing perfectly off the marble pillars. "This ring is a cubic zirconia fake. The wedding is off, you broke fraud." She threw the ring directly at Malik's chest. It hit his tuxedo jacket and bounced onto the polished floor, rolling away into the shadows. The cubic zirconia ring bounced across the polished marble floor with a hollow, pathetic click. It was a remarkably small sound, but in the dead silence of the St. Regis ballroom it echoed like a gunshot. For exactly 3 seconds, no one moved. The 500 guests were paralyzed, their brains struggling to process the absolute implosion of an Atlanta dynasty. Then the room erupted. It was a tidal wave of well-dressed panic. The Kensington patriarchs surged to their feet, shouting furiously at the catering staff and demanding answers. Vanguard executives in the crowd, recognizing my face and instantly understanding the magnitude of the financial crime unfolding before them, began frantically dialing their compliance departments and federal contacts. Malik dropped to his knees in his custom tuxedo, his hands scrambling blindly over the marble floor as he desperately searched for the fake ring, as if retrieving the worthless piece of glass could somehow rewind time and save his life. Vivian remained frozen at the head table, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the linen cloth so tightly her acrylic nails threatened to snap. Pastor Calvin watched his son groveling on the floor and realized the horrific truth. The collateral damage from Malik's exposure was about to drown him as well. Decades of meticulously curated respectability were evaporating before his eyes. But Calvin was a predator who had spent his entire life wearing sheep's clothing, and he still believed he could manipulate the flock. He lunged for the microphone Chloe had discarded on the sweetheart table. His hands were shaking violently, his forehead dripping with a thick sheen of panicked sweat, but he gripped the heavy metal cylinder and brought it to his lips. He cranked the volume, his booming, practiced pulpit voice cutting forcefully through the chaotic din of the ballroom. "Brethren, please be seated," Pastor Calvin bellowed, slipping instinctively into the rhythmic cadence of a Sunday morning sermon. "I ask for quiet. We are witnessing a spiritual attack. The enemy is in this room tonight. The devil seeks to destroy this blessed union and this holy ministry with forged documents and digital lies. I ask the elders of Grace Heritage to stand with me in prayer. Do not let this vicious test of faith divide our flock. Do not let the deceiver win. He raised his free hand toward the ceiling, his eyes squeezed shut in a display of manufactured desperate piety. He actually thought it was going to work. He thought he could use the name of God to blind the very people he had spent the last 5 years robbing blind. I did not let him finish his prayer. I walked toward the stage, my emerald silk gown trailing elegantly behind me. My heels clicked with a steady, lethal rhythm against the hardwood steps as I ascended the platform. I walked right past a weeping, hyperventilating Malik and stopped exactly 2 feet away from the pastor. He opened his eyes, his pastoral mask slipping to reveal the terrified, pathetic man beneath. I reached out, my grip firm and uncompromising, and plucked the microphone directly from his sweating, trembling fingers. "There is no spiritual attack happening here tonight, Pastor Calvin," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers with glacial, absolute authority. There is only a man who thought his congregation was too blinded by faith to look at their own ledger. I raised my right hand and signaled the audiovisual booth a second time. The massive digital screen behind us flickered. Malik's offshore gambling debts and the flashing bankruptcy warnings vanished. In their place, a pristine high-definition PDF materialized, illuminating the stage in a harsh, unforgiving white light. It was a Vanguard wire authorization form, completely unredacted, bearing the official seals of the bank and the undeniable distinct signature of Pastor Calvin himself. I turned back to the crowd, my eyes scanning the tables near the front, where the senior members of Grace Heritage Church were seated. On the 4th of last month, exactly 2 days before Vanguard flagged Malik's shell company for fraudulent activity, an emergency transfer was initiated from the Grace Heritage Church Central Trust, I announced, projecting my voice, so every single syllable reached the back of the ballroom. Specifically, the funds were drawn directly from the elderly congregation's pension fund. A collective horrified gasp rose from the church tables. Elderly men and women congregants who had tithed 10% of their modest incomes to this man for 20 years stared up at the glowing screen in sheer disbelief. I retrieved a laser pointer from the podium and aimed a bright green dot directly at the financial figures displayed on the 60-foot screen. $5 million, I stated mercilessly. The life savings, the retirement funds, and the widow's benefits of over 300 senior congregants. Authorized by the man standing next to me, wired out of a protected Vanguard trust, and routed directly into a Cayman Islands account controlled by Apex Global Betting. You did not invest the church's future, Pastor. You liquidated your congregation's survival to cover your son's offshore sportsbook deficit. Pastor Calvin physically shrank, his broad shoulders collapsing inward as the evidence of his profound treachery loomed massively behind him. He looked out at the faces of his elders, raising his hands in a weak, trembling gesture of surrender. "That is doctored," Calvin stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, airy wheeze. "That is a fabricated file. I have never seen that document in my life. I am a man of God. It is a certified bank record." Pastor Isaiah Montgomery thundered, stepping up to the very base of the stage. The legendary attorney's voice vibrated with a righteous, terrifying fury. "And the signature on that wire transfer perfectly matches the signature on the fraudulent property deeds you and Vivian just tried to pass off to a corrupt county notary 3 hours ago. You did not just drain the pension fund. You tried to forge a deacon board resolution to sell the sanctuary to buy your son a plane ticket to Dubai." The silence that followed Isaiah's revelation was different from the shock that had accompanied Chloe's canceled wedding. This silence was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with the dark, violent energy of absolute betrayal. At table 4, Deacon Miller slowly stood up. He was an 80-year-old man who had remortgaged his own home 10 years ago to help pay for the church's new roof. Beside him, Sister Evelyn rose to her feet. Her late husband's life insurance payout had gone entirely into that pension fund. One by one, the elders of Grace Heritage Church pushed their chairs back and stood. Decades of reverence, loyalty, and blind faith evaporated in a matter of seconds. The elders did not yell. They did not scream or throw things. They simply began to move. They advanced towards the stage in a terrifying, synchronized wave. The elderly men and women marched forward, their faces twisted into masks of pure, unadulterated rage. The two massive security guards who had flanked the doors earlier did not make a single move to stop them. They simply stepped aside, allowing the furious congregation to close the distance. Pastor Calvin stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes hitting the back edge of the stage riser. He looked frantically to his left, then to his right, his eyes wild with the realization that there was no escape. The stage was too high to jump from, and the front was entirely blocked by a wall of congregants demanding their lives back. He was completely, hopelessly cornered by the very flock he had tried to slaughter. The elders of Grace Heritage Church did not touch Pastor Calvin. They did not have to. Their collective silent advance forced him backward until his spine hit the edge of the stage, his polished shoes slipping on the marble floor. The man who had spent 2 decades demanding 10% of their paychecks now trembled before them, babbling incoherent prayers for mercy that fell on completely deaf ears. From my vantage point on the stage, I watched the chaotic, beautiful destruction of the Calvin Empire. My eyes swept over Malik, who was currently curled into a pathetic ball near the sweetheart table, sobbing into his hands as Vanguard executives loudly instructed hotel security to lock down the perimeter. But it was Vivian I was truly watching. Vivian Calvin was a parasite, and parasites possess a remarkable instinct for survival. While her husband pleaded for his life and her son wept over his shattered grift, Vivian did not rush to their sides. She did not defend her family. She took one look at the 60-foot digital screen displaying their financial ruin, calculated the exact trajectory of the sinking ship, and decided to abandon it. I watched her slip off her diamond necklace, dropping the heavy stones into her designer clutch to hide the evidence of her excess. She lowered her head, blending into the shadows cast by the towering floral arrangements, and began to weave her way along the perimeter of the ballroom. Her target was the heavy oak service doors near the kitchen. She moved with the silent, desperate urgency of a thief slipping away into the night. She was 10 feet away from the exit, 5 feet. She reached a manicured hand toward the brass handle. A massive flat palm slammed against the wood directly above her hand, sealing the door shut with a violent crack. Vivian gasped, spinning around. Richard Kensington stood towering over her. The billionaire real estate mogul and patriarch of the Kensington family was practically radiating a lethal, icy fury. He looked down at the woman who had just tried to chain his daughter to $3 million of federal wire fraud. "You are not going anywhere, Vivian," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "You do not get to try and ruin my daughter and then just slip out the back door. You are going to stand right here and face exactly what you are." Before Vivian could attempt to manipulate the billionaire, a new sound cut through the chaos of the ballroom. It was the sharp, metallic tap of a microphone. Isaiah Montgomery had taken the microphone from my hand. He did not yell. He did not bellow like Pastor Calvin. He simply spoke, and his voice was so deeply saturated with quiet, lethal authority that it commanded absolute obedience. The shouting Vanguard executives fell silent. The furious church elders stopped their advance. The entire 500-person guest list turned their attention back to the stage. "We are not quite finished," Isaiah said smoothly, his dark eyes tracking across the room until they locked onto Vivian, who was currently pinned against the service doors by Richard Kensington. "Bring her to the front, Richard. She needs a clear view of the screen." Richard grabbed Vivian by the elbow, ignoring her shrill protests, and forcefully escorted her down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them, staring in disgust, as the once proud pastor's wife was marched forward like a common criminal. Richard released her at the base of the stage, right next to her husband, who was still trembling in a cold sweat. Isaiah gave me a brief, affirming nod. I raised my hand and signaled the audio-visual booth for the final time. The massive screen behind us flickered again. The banking spreadsheets and the bright red fraud warnings vanished. The room was suddenly illuminated by the soft gray light of a scanned, yellowing piece of paper. It was a deeply mundane document complete with typed columns and a faded hospital logo at the top center. The crowd squinted, trying to decipher the text. Vivian, however, did not need to squint. The moment the document materialized on the screen, her knees buckled. She let out a sharp, breathless whimper, clapping both hands over her mouth as if trying to physically hold her soul inside her body. What you are looking at is a staff deployment log from Atlanta Memorial Hospital. Isaiah explained, his voice echoing with a chilling surgical precision. The date is October 14th, 1999. It is a date that has been burned into my memory for 27 years. Isaiah took a slow, measured step forward on the stage, looking down at Vivian. That was the night my wife gave birth to our first and only child. Isaiah continued, the absolute heartbreak of his past bleeding through his hardened exterior. A healthy, beautiful baby girl. It was the happiest day of my life, and it lasted exactly 6 hours. Because at 2 in the morning, the hospital fire alarms were mysteriously triggered. The security cameras on the third-floor neonatal wing went dark for exactly 4 minutes. When the emergency lights came back on, our daughter was gone from her bassinet. A wave of shocked, horrified murmurs swept through the high society crowd. Everyone in Atlanta knew the tragic story of the Montgomery kidnapping. It was a cold case that had haunted the city for decades. The police interviewed everyone, Isaiah said, his gaze narrowing into a laser-focused glare aimed directly at Vivian's trembling form. But the investigation yielded nothing. The cameras caught no faces. The alarms caused too much chaos. The case went cold. But the police made one crucial mistake. They were looking for a professional kidnapping ring. They were not looking at the disgruntled, deeply envious shift supervisor who was fired 3 weeks later for stealing medical supplies. A woman who used her maiden name on the hospital registry and quietly relocated to a different county shortly after her termination. I clicked the laser pointer, highlighting a specific row on the yellow document displayed on the massive screen. A bright green dot circled a typed name. Vivian Hayes, registered nurse. Neonatal wing supervisor. Shift hours 8 at night to 6 in the morning. October 14th, 1999. The collective gasp from the ballroom was deafening. Pastor Calvin slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had known she was a thief. He had known she forged checks. He had no idea she was a monster. Vivian began to shake violently. The immaculate, wealthy facade she had worn for decades was completely gone, replaced by the cornered, frantic panic of a sociopath who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. Richard Kensington stepped back from her in visible disgust. "You cannot prove anything," Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the marble pillars. "You have a staffing log. That means nothing. I was a nurse. I worked hard. You are trying to frame me because you hate our ministry." I was standing right next to her bassinet. Vivian screamed, completely losing her grip on reality as the panic consumed her. Her chest heaved, her expensive makeup running down her face. She was crying, but not out of remorse. She was crying because she was caught. "I saved her!" Vivian bellowed at the crowd, pointing a shaking finger up at me. "I saved that girl. You rich people think you can just buy happiness. I saw the way you and your wife looked at her, Isaiah. You were too busy with your law firm. You were too obsessed with secular wealth. She needed a righteous home. She needed strict discipline. I brought her to the church. I gave her a purpose. She was meant to serve us. It was God's will." The entire ballroom recoiled in pure, unadulterated revulsion. She had actually convinced herself that kidnapping an infant to use as an unpaid domestic servant was a holy mission. She had rationalized decades of psychological abuse and forced labor by dressing it up as divine intervention. Isaiah did not yell. He did not react to her twisted, sickening justification. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp, folded piece of thick medical paper bearing the seal of a premier genetic testing laboratory. He held the document up under the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. "You didn't save her," Isaiah said, his voice vibrating with the absolute devastating weight of a father who had finally brought his enemy to justice. You stole my heiress and turned her into a slave to fund your mediocre son. The ballroom floor might as well have turned to glass and shattered under Vivian's feet. She crumpled her knees, hitting the polished marble with a dull, heavy thud. The fierce, arrogant matriarch who had dictated the social hierarchy of Atlanta's elite was gone. In her place was a hollowed-out shell of a woman hyperventilating as the absolute reality of her crimes crashed down upon her. She clutched at the fabric of her expensive gown, her manicured fingers clawing at the silk as she realized there was no lie big enough to cover up a DNA test and a kidnapping charge. Even Pastor Calvin backed away from his wife. The man who had stood at the pulpit for 20 years preaching forgiveness and family unity looked at the woman he had married with pure, unadulterated revulsion. He bumped into the edge of the stage, his hands raised in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender toward the furious congregation closing in around him. The wolves had finally turned on the shepherds, but Malik could not accept that the game was over. His brain, hardwired for grifting and relentless manipulation, scrambled frantically for a lifeline. His fake tech empire was exposed. His offshore accounts were frozen. The Kensington fortune had just slipped through his fingers, along with the cubic zirconia ring now lost under a catering table. The church pension he had stolen was glaring in bright red letters on a 60-foot screen. He was trapped. His wild, bloodshot eyes darted around the room before locking onto me. He saw the custom emerald gown. He saw the genuine diamonds resting against my collarbone. He saw Isaiah Montgomery, a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, standing beside me as my father. Malik did not see a victim who had endured 2 decades of psychological torture. He saw his final mark. He saw a bank vault. "Zuri, wait." Malik gasped, his voice cracking into an embarrassing, high-pitched whine as he practically crawled toward the center of the room. The 2 massive security guards immediately stepped forward to intercept him, their hands reaching for the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. I raised my hand, a single sharp motion that stopped them in their tracks. I wanted everyone in this room to witness the true depth of his delusion. I wanted Atlanta's elite, the church elders, and the vanguard executives to see exactly how a predator operates when cornered and stripped of his power. "Let him speak," I commanded. My voice was steady, resonating through the silent ballroom with effortless, undeniable authority. Malik scrambled forward, stopping just short of the stage. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide and pleading. He plastered on the charismatic, boyish charm he had used to con elderly church members and wealthy investors alike. It was a grotesque, jarring performance given the damning evidence glowing on the screen behind me. "Zuri, you have to listen to me," Malik begged, his hands clasped together against his chest. "This is all a massive misunderstanding. You know us. You know me. We grew up together in that house. We are family. My mother. She might have made a mistake when you were a baby, but she raised you. She put a roof over your head. We took care of you when you had nowhere else to go." A collective murmur of profound disgust rippled through the crowd. Even Chloe Kensington, standing by the sweetheart table with her arms crossed defensively over her chest, let out a harsh, incredulous laugh at the sheer audacity of his words. "You cannot let them do this to us." Zuri, Malik continued, his voice taking on a frantic, desperate pitch. He completely ignored the furious crowd, focusing entirely on me, trying to trigger some latent sense of loyalty he assumed I still harbored. "Think about the good times. Think about how close we were. I always looked out for you. I always protected you from my parents when they were too hard on you. You know I love you like a sister. We are bonded, Zuri. You cannot just stand there and let these strangers tear our family apart. Tell them to stop. Tell Mr. Montgomery to call off the police. We can handle this privately. We can share the church assets. We can fix this together." He dropped heavily to his knees. The fabric of his custom tuxedo trousers snagged on the marble floor. He looked up at me, pressing his hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. "Please, Zuri," he whimpered, tears streaming down his face, leaving streaks through his expensive cologne and sweat. "You are a good person. You are forgiving. Do not do this to your family. I stood at the edge of the stage and looked down at the pathetic, trembling man kneeling before me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing but the cold, purifying clarity of absolute closure. The chains they had wrapped around my mind for 27 years were gone. I let the silence stretch. I let the weight of his absurd gaslighting plea hang in the heavy air for 5 full seconds, ensuring every single guest in the ballroom absorbed the sheer toxic audacity of his lies. When I finally spoke, my voice was dangerously calm. It did not boom over the microphone. It sliced through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You did not protect me, Malik," I said slowly, enunciating every syllable so that it carried to the back of the room. "You used me. You watched your mother force me to scrub your floors, wash your clothes, and serve your meals while you paraded around in sports cars bought with stolen money. You never treated me like a sister. You treated me like property. You only remember the concept of family now because you realize I hold the keys to a kingdom you desperately want to steal." Malik opened his mouth to protest, but the look in my eyes froze the words in his throat. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into his terrified, desperate eyes. "A maid does not have family. Malik," I said, my voice echoing with icy, crushing finality. "She only has a boss, and you are fired." The finality of the statement hit him like a physical blow. He slumped forward, his hands hitting the floor as the last shred of his fabricated reality disintegrated. He let out a low, agonizing wail, a sound completely stripped of his usual arrogant charm. At that exact moment, a new sound bled into the heavy silence of the St. Regis ballroom. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance. Within seconds, it multiplied, growing louder and more urgent as it echoed off the downtown skyscrapers. The unmistakable, piercing scream of approaching sirens cut through the elegant, soundproofed walls of the hotel. It was not just one police cruiser, it was an entire fleet. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the panicked faces of the Calvin family in harsh, unforgiving colors. The low hum of the ballroom instantly shattered into a fever pitch of absolute chaos. Vanguard executives began shouting into their phones. Church elders linked arms, forming a human barricade to block the exits, determined to keep their thieving pastor and his family from escaping. The flashing lights swept across the ballroom walls in a dizzying, hypnotic rhythm. The authorities had arrived. The reckoning was no longer just a threat. It was here. The heavy oak doors of the St. Regis ballroom did not simply open. They were violently thrust apart. A flood of dark windbreakers and heavy tactical gear poured into the immaculate space, a jarring, brutal contrast to the imported crystal and white silk. FBI agents, flanked by a heavily armed division of the Atlanta Police Department, moved with synchronized, terrifying precision. They fanned out instantly, securing every exit, their radios crackling with sharp, clipped commands that cut through the hysteria of the crowd. The Vanguard executives and high society guests parted like the Red Sea, practically pointing the federal agents toward the stage. Malik's survival instinct finally overrode his shock. The sight of the federal badges snapped him out of his weeping paralysis. He scrambled off his knees, his expensive custom trousers slipping frantically on the polished marble. He lunged toward the narrow corridor behind the sweetheart table, a desperate rat seeking a drainpipe, abandoning his family without a second thought. But he forgot about the bride he had just humiliated. Chloe Kensington was standing exactly where she had dropped her fake ring. Her massive custom silk wedding gown pooled around her in a wide, heavy circle of tulle and lace. As Malik darted past, her eyes locked on the service hallway, Chloe did not step out of his way. She looked at him with absolute disdain and subtly shifted her weight, kicking the heavy beaded train of her dress directly into his frantic path. Malik's polished shoe caught the thick fabric. He went completely airborne. His arms flailed wildly in the air for one suspended second before he crashed face first into the unyielding marble floor with a sickening heavy crunch. Before he could even groan, 2 federal agents were on his back. They pinned his arms, driving a knee into his spine as they wrenched his wrists together. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply in the sudden quiet of the room. A lead FBI agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and a completely merciless demeanor, stepped onto the platform. She did not need a microphone. Her voice carried the unmistakable crushing weight of a federal warrant. "Malik Calvin," she announced, looking down at the bleeding, sobbing man pinned to the floor. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft." Next to him, Pastor Calvin was forcefully pulled away from the barricade of furious church elders. He did not fight. The fight had been entirely drained out of him. He simply went limp, weeping openly and blubbering broken prayers as his hands were wrenched behind his back. The agent turned her piercing gaze to him. "Marcus Calvin," she stated, reading from a thick folder pulled from her jacket. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and the embezzlement of $5 million from the Grace Heritage Pension Trust." The elders of the church watched with grim satisfaction as their former spiritual leader was hauled to his feet like a common criminal. But the federal agent was not finished. She turned toward the back of the room, her eyes locking onto the matriarch. Vivian was still pinned against the service doors by Richard Kensington. She was panting heavily, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a non-existent loophole. Two officers marched down the center aisle, grabbing her by the arms and pulling her forcefully away from the wall. "Vivian Calvin," the lead agent announced, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings. "You and your husband are also being taken into federal custody for the 1999 abduction of Zuri Montgomery. The charges include federal kidnapping, child endangerment, and decades of identity fraud." The word kidnapping hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. The wealthy guests, the church members, and the hotel staff stared in absolute, unadulterated horror. They were not just looking at grifters anymore. They were looking at monsters. The realization that her pristine, aristocratic life was entirely over finally fractured Vivian's mind. She thrashed violently as the officers secured her wrists. The polished, elegant facade she had maintained for years evaporated, replaced by pure, feral rage. She kicked and twisted her expensive designer gown, tearing at the seams as she fought the cold metal biting into her skin. Her manicured nails snapped as she clawed futilely at the officers. She bared her teeth, shrieking obscenities that made the church elders recoil in shock. The woman who had judged everyone in Atlanta for their lack of refinement was now screaming like a rabid animal. The officers dragged her forcefully down the main aisle, her heels skidding uselessly against the marble. She dug her feet in, forcing them to haul her directly past the spot where I stood shoulder to shoulder with Isaiah Montgomery. Vivian locked eyes with me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Her makeup was smeared, her hair wild, but her eyes burned with the toxic arrogance of a woman who still believed she was superior. She lunged against the officer's tight grip, straining her neck to spit her final vitriolic poison in my direction. "You will always be nothing but a servant," Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical fury as the police forced her toward the doors. "You are trash. You belong in a basement. You will never be one of them." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the pathetic, broken woman who had stolen my childhood, who had forced me to scrub her floors while she spent my rightful inheritance. I smiled. It was a genuine, freezing expression of absolute, undeniable victory. I stepped forward, leaning in close so my voice would pierce directly through her frantic screaming. "Enjoy the prison cafeteria, Vivian," I whispered softly. "I hear the floors need scrubbing." The morning sun, reflecting off the glass facade of Montgomery and Associates, felt entirely different from the light that used to filter through the basement window of the Calvin estate. I stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table on the 40th floor, looking down at the bustling Atlanta streets. Down there, the city was waking up to front-page news of the biggest high society scandal of the decade. Up here, the air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of expensive leather and absolute victory. Isaiah sat quietly near the window, sipping black coffee. He had insisted this meeting was mine to handle. He knew I needed to bury the ghost of my past with my own two hands. The heavy glass door swung open and Arthur Vance walked in. He was a mid-level defense attorney who had clearly not slept. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was askew, and he carried a thin, pathetic-looking manila folder. He had been retained by Malik mere hours before the FBI completely locked down the Calvin family's communications. Vance dropped his briefcase onto the polished wood, looking at me with a patronizing smirk that told me he still thought he was dealing with an uneducated maid who had merely gotten lucky. Miss Montgomery Vance began dragging out my new last name as if it were a joke. Let us skip the pleasantries. My clients are sitting in federal holding, which we all know is a temporary inconvenience. I am here to offer you a very generous compromise. Malik is willing to authorize the return of roughly $500,000 to the Grace Heritage Pension Fund. In exchange, you will immediately drop your frivolous civil suit, and you will instruct your legal team to back off the pressure on the federal prosecutor. We can make this all go away nice and quiet. I did not sit down. I simply looked at the lawyer, letting the sheer absurdity of his offer hang in the quiet room. He shifted his weight, his smirk faltering slightly under my unrelenting gaze. $500,000. I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotion. You are offering me 10 cents on the dollar for the money Malik stole from elderly church members, and in return you want full immunity for a family of kidnappers, embezzlers, and fraudsters. Vance bristled, leaning over the table. Listen to me, little girl. You might have played a good trick at the St. Regis, but you do not understand how the real world works. Malik Calvin is a well-connected man. If you drag this out in civil court, he will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. He will hide those offshore accounts so deep you will never see a single dime. Take the deal. It is the best you are ever going to get. I reached out and slowly opened the thick, leather-bound ledger sitting in front of me. Let me explain the real world to you, Mr. Vance, I said, sliding a thick stack of court-stamped documents across the mahogany table. A civil suit is not a negotiation when the plaintiff already holds all the cards. It is an execution. And the execution happened at 8 o'clock this morning. Vance frowned, picking up the first document. His eyes scanned the text, and the arrogant color instantly drained from his face. I did not just hack Malik's offshore accounts to embarrass him at a wedding. I continued, my tone conversational, but lethal. I documented the routing numbers. I tracked the shell companies. I handed a complete decrypted financial roadmap to the Vanguard Fraud Division and the FBI Cybercrimes Unit. As of this morning, a federal judge has granted an emergency injunction. Every single asset tied to the Calvin name has been frozen, seized, or placed under a federal lien. Vance flipped frantically through the pages, his breathing growing shallow. The $3 million in the Cayman account is locked, I stated, stepping around the table and pacing slowly behind him. The deed to the Calvin estate is currently in the possession of the federal government as collateral for the church pension fund. The luxury fleet of vehicles Malik paraded around in the G-Wagon, the Range Rover, the vintage Porsche were impounded by authorities at midnight. I even filed a separate civil asset forfeiture claim on Vivian's jewelry collection, her designer handbags, and the custom furs she bought using tithe money. They are sitting in an evidence locker. You cannot do this, Vance stammered, his hands shaking so badly the papers rattled. This violates due process. They are entitled to funds for their legal defense. They are entitled to a public defender, I corrected sharply. Because as of this exact second, Vivian Calvin and Malik have a net worth of $0. Actually factoring in the restitution they owe the church elders and the damages for 27 years of forced labor and kidnapping, their net worth is somewhere in the negative $50 million range. They do not even own the clothes on their backs, Mr. Vance. Everything was bought with stolen money. Everything belongs to the people they robbed. I paused, leaning down so my face was inches from the sweating lawyer. Which brings me to my next point, I whispered, watching his eyes widen in realization. Did Malik pay your retainer up front? Vance swallowed hard, a drop of sweat rolling down his temple. He wrote me a check last night. I smiled, tapping my manicured fingernail against the table. I would suggest you tear it up. That account was frozen at 6 this morning. The check is going to bounce and you are currently working for free. The attorney did not say another word. He practically scrambled out of his chair, shoving the documents back into his briefcase. He did not look back as he practically sprinted out of the glass doors, abandoning his clients just as quickly as they had abandoned their morals. Isaiah chuckled softly from the window. "You have your mother's ruthless streak, Zuri. It is a beautiful thing to watch." Before I could respond, the sleek digital phone on the center of the conference table buzzed loudly. The caller ID simply read Fulton County Correctional Facility. I pressed the speaker button. An automated robotic voice filled the room. "You have a collect call from an inmate at the Fulton County Jail. To accept charges, press 1. I pressed the button. Zuri, a voice wailed through the speaker. It was Malik. He sounded entirely destroyed. The arrogant, slick con artist was completely gone, replaced by a sobbing, broken shell of a man. The background noise of the jail, the clanging metal doors and shouting guards echoed behind his pathetic whimpers. "Zuri, please!" Malik begged, his breath hitching in pure panic. "You have to help me. They put me in general population. It is horrible here. The food is rotten. The bed is concrete. My lawyer is not answering my calls. You have to tell them to let me out." I stood in the center of the beautiful sunlit office, looking out at the city I now owned a piece of. "I know you are mad," Malik sobbed, his voice cracking. "I know we messed up, but I am begging you. Just send some money to my commissary account. Just $50, Zuri. Please, I need soap. I need something to eat. I am starving. We are family. You cannot just leave me in here to rot." I leaned down close to the speakerphone. "I charge $500 an hour for consultations, Malik," I said, my voice dripping with absolute freezing finality. "You cannot afford me." I pressed the red button, cutting the line dead. The red button on the console flashed once as the line went dead. I stood in the quiet elegance of the Montgomery and Associates boardroom, letting the absolute silence wash over me. The Calvin family was financially annihilated. Their legacy was entirely reduced to ash. But as I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, a heavy knot remained in my chest. Destroying the monsters who stole my life was only half of the equation. The wreckage they left behind was vast, and the deepest collateral damage had been inflicted on the most vulnerable people in the city. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside Grace Heritage Church was suffocating. It was a Thursday evening, and an emergency town hall had been called. The sanctuary, usually a vibrant space filled with gospel music and joyful fellowship, felt more like a waiting room at a morgue. The majestic stained glass windows cast long, gloomy shadows across the worn wooden pews. The congregation was packed to the doors, but there was no joyous chatter. There was only the low, terrified murmur of a community that had just realized their entire financial foundation was built on quicksand. These were not wealthy investors who could afford to take a loss. These were retired school teachers, elderly bus drivers, and hardworking families who had poured their meager life savings into the Grace Heritage Pension and Retirement Trust. Marcus and Vivian Calvin had looked these people in the eye every Sunday, preaching about financial blessings and divine multiplication, all while funneling those exact tithes into offshore accounts and luxury vehicles. When the news of the federal indictments broke, panic had swept through the neighborhood like wildfire. The congregation believed their money was gone forever. They believed they were ruined. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary opened. The panicked murmurs instantly died in the throats of the congregation. The silence that swept over the room was absolute and incredibly heavy. I walked down the center aisle. I was not wearing the faded, oversized clothes Vivian used to force upon me to make me look invisible. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, projecting total authority and unwavering stability. Isaiah Montgomery walked right beside me. He did not walk ahead of me like a savior, nor behind me like a shadow. He walked shoulder to shoulder with me, a silent, imposing fortress of support. As we moved toward the front, I looked into the faces of the people in the pews. I saw Sister Patterson, who had once scolded me for not polishing the church brass quickly enough, her eyes now wide with profound shame. I saw Deacon Hayes, a retired mechanic who had trusted Marcus Calvin with his entire pension, clutching his hat with trembling hands. For 27 years, Vivian had systematically poisoned this community against me. She had painted me as a troubled, rebellious charity case that she and the pastor had graciously taken in out of the goodness of their Christian hearts. She had weaponized their faith, ensuring that if I ever tried to speak out, no one in this room would have believed a word I said. Now the federal news cycle had exposed the monstrous truth. The congregation knew I was the kidnapped heir to a billionaire empire, and they knew their beloved pastor and his wife were ruthless predators. The collective guilt radiating from the pews was palpable. I did not stop at the front row. I walked directly up the carpeted stairs and stepped behind the grand oak pulpit. It was the exact spot where Marcus Calvin had spent decades spewing his hypocritical sermons. I placed a thick leather-bound ledger on the polished wood. I did not need a microphone. In the dead silence of the sanctuary, my voice carried to the very last row. For nearly 3 decades, the people who stood behind this pulpit lied to you. I began, my voice steady, slicing through the heavy air. They told you I was a troubled girl. They told you I was ungrateful. They used your faith to isolate me, and they used your trust to rob you blind. You came to this building seeking community and spiritual guidance, and instead you were systematically bled dry by a family of con artists. A few soft, muffled sobs echoed from the back of the church. I looked directly at Deacon Hayes. I know why you are here tonight, I continued, softening my tone just enough to let the empathy bleed through the steel. You are terrified. You have watched the news. You know that Malik Calvin's tech empire was a shell game, and you know that your pension funds were drained to pay for Vivian's designer gowns and Marcus's offshore investments. You think your life savings are gone. You think your futures have been stolen. I placed my hand firmly on the leather ledger. You are wrong, I stated with absolute ringing clarity. The entire congregation collectively held its breath. When I brought my legal team down on the Calvin family, I did not just do it for my own justice, I explained, looking across the sea of faces. We mathematically dismantled every single account tied to their name. We seized their cars. We seized the estate. We froze the Cayman Island accounts. We stripped them down to the very lint in their pockets. And as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, a federal judge signed the final release order. Every single penny stolen from the Grace Heritage Pension Fund has been completely recovered. A unified gasp swept through the sanctuary. Sister Patterson dropped her face into her hands, weeping loudly. A wave of profound, desperate relief washed over the room, breaking the suffocating tension, but I raised my hand, signaling that I was not finished. Restoring what was stolen is only the bare minimum of justice, I said, my voice rising slightly, commanding their total attention. The trauma you have endured, the fear you have felt over the last few days, requires more than just breaking even. I gestured to the front pew where my father sat, watching me with an expression of overwhelming pride. The Montgomery Foundation does not tolerate predators, and we do not turn our backs on a community that has been victimized, I announced. My father and I have established a new, legally impenetrable trust for this congregation, managed by a completely independent third-party financial board. And to ensure that every single elder in this room can retire with dignity and absolute peace of mind, the Montgomery Foundation is matching the recovered funds. We are doubling the entire pension account. For 3 full seconds, the church was so quiet you could hear the traffic on the street outside. The magnitude of the statement took a moment to fully penetrate the collective shock. Then the sanctuary erupted. It did not start with polite applause. It started with a thunderous, overwhelming roar of pure, unrestrained joy. Deacon Hayes leapt to his feet, tears streaming down his weathered face, raising his hands toward the ceiling. Sister Patterson rushed out of her pew, followed by dozens of others. The entire congregation stood up, their applause echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a physical wave of gratitude. They were not just cheering for the money, they were cheering for the truth. They were cheering for the destruction of the lies that had held them captive. Elderly women and men crowded around the base of the pulpit. They reached out not to grasp at me, but to offer tearful, heartfelt apologies. They wept, asking for my forgiveness for being blind to my suffering, thanking me for not abandoning them when I had every right to turn my back on this place forever. I stepped down from the pulpit and walked directly into the crowd. I was immediately engulfed in a sea of warm, genuine embraces. For 27 years, I had walked the halls of this church as an invisible servant, carrying the crushing weight of isolation and fabricated shame. But standing there now, surrounded by the fierce protective gratitude of the people I had saved, I finally felt the one thing Vivian Calvin had tried so desperately to deny me. I felt the incredible, unbreakable warmth of true, unconditional love. The chains were gone, the community was healed, and for the first time in my life, I was finally home. The memory of that cheering, tear-soaked sanctuary fades into the quiet, ambient hum of the Atlanta skyline. The camera resumes its smooth, dynamic tracking orbit around me, capturing the sleek, undeniable reality of the present. I am sitting in the center of my penthouse, the plush velvet of the armchair soft against my hands. The custom emerald gown is put away. I am dressed in a sharp-tailored white suit, the ultimate antithesis of the faded gray maid uniforms Vivian used to force over my shoulders. The penthouse is not just a home, it is a fortress built on truth. The walls are lined with modern art, the shelves are filled with business awards, and the side tables are crowded with framed photographs of my real family. There are no locks on the outside of my bedroom door. There are no curfews, no whispered threats, no cold basement floors. I breathe in the conditioned air, tasting the absolute, undisputed flavor of freedom. You are probably wondering what happened to the people who thought they could bury me alive. The justice system moves slowly, but when it is fueled by a mountain of decrypted offshore accounts and 27 years of undeniable federal kidnapping evidence, it moves with the crushing weight of a runaway freight train. Let us start with Malik, the boy who thought he was a prince, the man who believed he could grift his way into the billionaire class by stepping on my neck. He took a plea deal the absolute second he realized his high-priced attorneys were abandoning ship and his bank accounts were frozen solid. He is currently serving 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The universe has a brilliant, merciless sense of poetic irony. The man who used to throw his dirty cologne-soaked shirts at my face and demand I scrub his floors is now assigned to the maximum security prison laundry detail. He spends 14 hours a day washing soiled jumpsuits, folding scratchy sheets, and pushing heavy industrial carts for 12 cents an hour. I hear his hands are permanently blistered. He calls his public defender once a week, sobbing, begging for a transfer. The requests are always denied. Then there is Marcus and Vivian Calvin, the untouchable shepherds of Atlanta high society. The federal prosecutors did not offer them a deal. They took them to trial, and the trial was a public spectacle of absolute ruin. Every church elder they defrauded sat in the front row. Every lie they spun was dismantled piece by piece on national television. They were convicted on all 54 counts: kidnapping, wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and conspiracy. They are both facing 25 years to life. Vivian was stripped of her imported silks and forced into a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The woman who dictated the social hierarchy of the elite now shares a 6x8 cell with a woman named Brenda, who does not care about her former country club status. I am told Vivian spends her days staring blankly at the concrete wall, completely detached from reality, still muttering harsh orders to a maid who no longer exists. Marcus tried to start a prison ministry to gather a new flock. The other inmates laughed him out of the yard. And we cannot forget the lovely Chloe Kensington. Her fairy tale wedding shattered her reputation. In ruins, she scrambled desperately to save face. She needed a quick fix to prove she was still a winner. 3 months after the St. Regis disaster, she eloped with a flashy cryptocurrency investor she met in Miami. It was a match made in heaven until the crypto market crashed overnight. Her new husband was investigated for running a decentralized Ponzi scheme. The feds seized his digital wallets, leaving them completely bankrupt. Chloe now lives in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, frantically pawning the cubic zirconia jewelry she once flaunted. She works the perfume counter at a mid-tier department store, forcing a stiff, humiliating smile every time a former socialite walks past her. It is not just about the revenge. Vengeance is a fire that burns out quickly. This is about restoration. The Vanguard Technology Company is flourishing, saving thousands of lives through our advanced medical software. The Grace Heritage community has a new fully funded pension, and they recently elected a board of transparent, honest leaders. They send me a thank you card every single month. I keep every single one of them. I stand up from the armchair. The camera glides backward, keeping me perfectly in frame as I walk across the expansive living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows stretch across the entire wall, offering a panoramic, breathtaking view of the city. The sun is just beginning to set, painting the Atlanta sky in vibrant streaks of violet and burning gold. I look down at the streets below. I do not feel anger anymore. I do not feel the heavy, suffocating shadow of my past. I am completely, utterly whole. The soft chime of the private elevator alerts me. The polished doors slide open, and Isaiah Montgomery steps into the penthouse. He is smiling, carrying 2 crystal flutes and a bottle of vintage champagne. He looks healthy, vibrant, and completely at peace. He walks over to me, handing me a glass. He does not say a word, because words are no longer necessary between us. We share a bond forged in 27 years of agonizing separation and solidified by an unbreakable, triumphant reunion. He clinks his glass against mine. The clear, sharp ring echoes beautifully in the quiet, luxurious space. I take a slow sip of the champagne. The bubbles are crisp and cold against my tongue. I turn away from the skyline and look directly into the camera lens. My gaze is steady, piercing, and entirely victorious. I let the silence stretch for one perfect beat, making sure every single person watching understands the absolute weight of my next words. They told me some people are born to serve. They were right. I served them exactly what they deserved. The camera pushes in rapidly, zooming straight into my victorious, unyielding smile, holding the frame for a split second before cutting sharply to black. True power does not come from waiting for apologies from those who broke you. It comes from meticulously building your own empire in silence. This journey teaches us that blood does not equate to loyalty, and forced servitude is never family. When toxic relatives severely underestimate your absolute worth, simply let them. You can use their blinding arrogance as the perfect blueprint for their inevitable destruction. Reclaiming your life means freezing their control, recovering your stolen peace, and replacing inherited trauma with a chosen community. Have you ever cut off a toxic relative? Share your triumphant story down below today.